Hey guys, tonight we begin with the medieval rumors that were so wild, so impossible, and so deeply ridiculous that everyone laughed at them, right up until they turned out to be true. You find yourself stepping into a world where monks whisper in cloisters, peasants peek through shutters, and kings pray. No one discovers the skeletons rattling in their vaulted chambers. These are the stories that begin as drunken gossip in a tavern, then somehow end with a royal decree quietly confirming, yes, the weird thing really happened. Medieval Europe may look calm in tapestries, but beneath the polite embroidery is a boiling pot of paranoia, mischief, and secrets that somehow survive the centuries. So before you get too cozy, take a second to gently tap that new hype button YouTube just added. It really does help little guys like me push through the algorithm. And be sure to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now, get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You step into a medieval world where suspicion clings to the air thicker than wood smoke from 100 crooked chimneys. The sun has barely risen, but the streets already buzz with whispered theories that seem to ripple between shutters and doorways, as if the town itself is trying to tell you something. You hear two bakers muttering about monks who move around at night carrying scrolls no one is supposed to see. A shepherd swears the Lord's steward is not the real steward, just a cousin in a wig pretending to collect taxes. It sounds absurd, but everyone nods with the solemnity of people who have learned the hard way that ridiculous things occasionally happen in this place. You take a step forward, and even the puddles look like they are hiding something. The town square looks harmless enough. A fountain trickles, pigeons strut with an inflated sense of authority, and a vegetable vendor rearranges his wilted cabbages as if that will convince someone they are still edible. Yet, beneath the modest scenery, you sense an undercurrent of tension, the kind that makes even the church bells sound as though they are ringing coded messages. Someone coughs behind you, and 3 different people glance your way as though trying to determine if you are here to trade wool or expose a conspiracy. Apparently, there is little difference. You cross the square, passing a cluster of old women sitting on a bench. Their hands are busy spinning thread, but their voices weave something entirely different. They insist that a traveling merchant stayed in the village 2 nights ago, then vanished without paying his bill or leaving footprints. One woman claims she heard chanting from the forest at dawn, the sort of chanting that only happens when people want the moon to mind its own business. Another insists she saw the priest burying something behind the church that definitely was not a saint, unless saints are allowed to come in burlap sacks. Their tone is casual, almost cheerful, as though recounting recipes, which is somehow more unsettling. You continue down a narrow alley where sunlight barely reaches the ground. A tanner tips a bucket of foul-smelling water into the gutter and squints at you with curiosity. He asks if you to know about the secret council that supposedly meets under the old mill. You do not, mostly because no one sane should. Yet he describes it in such detail, from the torches to the mysterious hooded figure who always arrives last, that it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss. You half expect him to pull out a map and schedule. Instead, he shrugs, thumps his bucket, and suggests you watch your back. People disappear around here, he says, but not always the ones you expect. By the time you reach the edge of town, you realize no one seems alarmed by these tales. Conspiracies are treated like weather forecasts. You hear distant shouts from the training yard where local militiamen practice with rusty spears. One jokes that the Baron pretends he does not know about the smuggling ring in the outer barns, even though he is the one who started it. Laughter follows, but it has an uncomfortable edge, the kind that suggests no one is entirely joking. You move on, trying not to imagine the barns glowing ominously at night. You pass a young scribe perched beside the abbey wall, scratching notes onto parchment with an intensity usually reserved for apocalyptic visions. He tells you that he once copied a letter sealed with the crest of a noble family that officially died out 2 generations ago. When he brought it to the abbot told him to burn it and never speak of it again. The scribe looks around nervously, as if expecting the wall behind him to sprout ears. He warns you that the abbey stores more than prayer books, and that sometimes the candles flicker for reasons unrelated to drafts or angels. The forest beyond the fields looks peaceful, but every villager you pass warns you to avoid it after sunset, not because of wolves, although they exist, but because of the singing. They describe harmonies too perfectly pitched to be human, drifting through the trees like threads of cold silver. Some say it is a secret cult. Others swear it is a group of exiles who learned new tricks. One man insists the forest itself sings to lure wanderers deeper, which feels like one rumor too many, until he adds that last winter a hunter returned home speaking in a language no one recognized. After a week, he stopped speaking altogether. By now, the whole world feels like a tapestry stitched with lies, truth, panic, and whatever the medieval version of sarcasm is. You breathe in the crisp morning air and realize you cannot tell where superstition ends and reality begins. In this era, the unbelievable is sometimes the most reliable thing. You walk forward, surrounded by the murmur of secrets that refuse to die, and you start to understand why. Everyone watches the shadows so carefully. Here the truth does not hide behind logic. It hides behind the next corner, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to look. You discover quickly that medieval rulers are far more terrified than they ever appear in their portraits. Those paintings make them look serene and unbothered, lounging in embroidered robes while gazing nobly into the distance. In reality, if you step behind the velvet curtains and into the narrow corridors where their advisors whisper, you find monarchs pacing like anxious cats, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, and suspecting betrayal from anyone who can hold a quill. You learn that the grand thrones are mostly for show. The real decisions are made in cramped rooms that smell like ink, sweat, and the unmistakable aroma of fear, politely trying not to draw attention to itself. You stand in a royal council chamber where tapestries hang heavy and the candles burn low, not because it creates atmosphere, but because bright light would show the wrinkles of anxiety on every official's face. The king sits stiffly, pretending to read a report, while subtly checking whether the window shutters are secured. He is convinced that someone is listening outside, even though the only soul near the balcony is an overfed pigeon contemplating its life choices. His scribe tiptoes across the room as though sound itself might trigger a coup. You see maps laid out across the table, not marking enemy armies, but marking where suspicious whispers have been heard. Territories are labeled with circles and notes that read nothing like military strategy. Instead, they say things like possibly plotting or might own too many knives. In the hallway, a royal guard polishes his spear with the frantic dedication of a man who definitely does not sleep enough. He glances your way with the hollow stare of someone who has been asked to stand outside the king's chamber all night because His Majesty heard footsteps that might have been mice or assassins, or possibly mice hired by assassins. You begin to suspect that the most powerful man in the kingdom is also the most frightened. Rulers here are not shaped by conquest. They are shaped by the constant dread of losing everything in a single unfortunate hour. You step into a private solar where a queen sits surrounded by letters. She opens them with a knife, not for practical reasons, but because she expects at least one to contain something unpleasant, possibly demands, accusations, or the occasional curse written in surprisingly elegant handwriting. Her ladies-in-waiting gossip about omens and prophecies, some invented on the spot to justify their nervous energy. Every rumor that reaches the queen's ears spawns 3 new precautions. She orders extra food tasters. She forbids certain herbs in the kitchen because someone heard they smell like treason. She refuses to drink wine if the servant pouring it looks too cheerful. You learn that royal paranoia is contagious. One anxious ruler can turn an entire palace into a hive of suspicion within a single afternoon. You wander through the library where advisors hide documents that could spark panic. Some are harmless, like trade records that look suspicious to people who cannot read numbers. Others are more unsettling, like reports from scouts who swear they saw lights in the woods or shadows moving where shadows should not move. The advisors fold these papers quickly and shove them into drawers before anyone asks questions. Information here is handled like unstable alchemy. One wrong sentence can explode into royal hysteria. Down in the courtyard, nobles pretend to stroll casually, though each one watches the others from the corner of their eye. They greet each other with polite smiles that tremble slightly at the edges. One noble shares a theory that the king's cousin wants the throne. Another whispers that the bishop knows too much about too many things. A third insists that the castle gardener has been acting strangely, which is concerning because gardeners tend to know exactly where to bury things. Voices lower whenever a window opens, even if the person inside is too far away to hear. It becomes clear that subtleness is a survival skill here, and everyone has mastered the art of looking calm while internally screaming. You reach the king's private chapel, where he kneels in fervent prayer. You expect solemn reverence, but instead you hear him whispering questions into the darkness. He asks the saints if his enemies are multiplying. He asks if his brother is secretly plotting. He even asks whether the castle cat has been spending time with the wrong people. His confessor tries to reassure him, but the king's hands remain tense and his eyes keep darting to the door. Even faith struggles to compete with the chaos inside his mind. By the time you leave the castle, you realize the kingdom is not held together by strength, but by a delicate network of fears. Rulers here do not simply reign, they survive. One suspicious glance at a time, shaping policies and punishments based not on reason, but on the quiet dread whispering in their ears. In this world, you learn that paranoia is not a flaw. It is governance. You hear the rumor first, from a traveling peddler chewing a piece of stale bread as if it has personally offended him. He leans in close, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial murmur that smells faintly of onions, and tells you that the monks in a nearby monastery hide secret messages inside their prayer books. He says it the way someone might say the sky sings at night. Utter nonsense, delivered with confidence. Yet the twitch in his eyes hints at something more, something he is afraid to speak aloud. By the time he wanders off toward the next village, you find yourself strangely compelled to follow the trail of this impossible claim, mostly because no one whispers this urgently about recipes or weather. As you approach the monastery, its stone walls rise like a fortress trying too hard to look serene. Ivy crawls up the exterior as though attempting to escape, and bells toll from somewhere deep within, their echo carrying the solemnity of men who take their secrets seriously. You step through the place, arched gate, and immediately feel the atmosphere shift. The courtyard is calm, but not peaceful. It is the calm of people who know they are being watched by forces far less forgiving than the abbey's statues. A few monks shuffle past, heads bowed, their expressions caught between devotion and mild panic. You sense that prayer here is less about meeting God and more about hoping he does not ask too many questions. Inside the scriptorium, the air tastes like ink and old parchment, a blend so potent it makes you feel as though you have stepped into the lungs of history itself. Scribes sit, hunched at long wooden desks, quills scratching in steady rhythm. They appear serene, but when you look closely, you notice the way their eyes flick toward the doorway whenever footsteps echo in the hall, as if expecting someone unexpected. One monk, younger than the others, glances at you with the jittery fear of someone who knows exactly how much trouble he could be in and assumes you might be here to deliver it. You watch as an elderly scribe delicately paints an illuminated capital letter, its curling gold leaf shimmering in the candlelight. It is beautiful, almost hypnotic. But then he shifts slightly, and you catch the faintest, irregular line running beneath the decorative border. Something that is definitely not part of the psalm he is copying. A symbol, maybe, or a mark hidden where only the most obsessive eye would notice. He covers it quickly with his sleeve and clears his throat so forcefully, you wonder if guilt is an airborne disease. You decide to explore further, slipping toward the shelves where finished manuscripts rest in neat stacks. They look innocent, bound in leather and arranged by size. But as you run a finger along the spines, you feel an odd texture under the surface, like raised dots or careful knife marks. You open one of the books, pretending to admire the artistry, and on the fourth page you see it, hidden between two lines of text, so faint you could mistake it for an ink blot, is a small encoded pattern. It resembles a sequence, a deliberate placement of tiny shapes disguised as decorative flourishes. The pattern repeats later in the margins, then again in another chapter, enough times to prove it is intentional. A monk steps up behind you, breathing softly, his hands clasped in a way that tries to signal serenity but mostly communicates fear. He gently closes the book, his fingers lingering on the cover as if trying to absorb its secrets before they escape. He tells you that some prayers are meant only for the eyes of the worthy. He says it with a smile far too polite to be comforting, then walks away before you can ask a single coherent question. His departure leaves behind a tension that buzzes louder than the quills scratching against parchment. You slip out of the scriptorium before anyone decides to escort you somewhere you cannot leave. Outside in the courtyard, the bells ring again, this time sounding more like warnings than worship. You cannot shake the feeling that the monks hide far more than prayers. Their ink strokes carry intention, their decorations carry messages, and their silence carries fear. Centuries later, you imagine scholars sitting in warm university offices, turning those same manuscripts under bright lamps and gasping as coded messages reveal themselves. They find warnings, political commentary, secret correspondence, and perhaps even full confessions disguised inside floral borders. They confirm what the peasants always suspected and what the monks always feared. The prayer books were not just devotion. They were encryption disguised as holiness. And now you understand why every monk avoided your eyes that morning. You had walked into a sanctuary built not only on faith, but on secrets that refused to stay silent. You walk into the village, just as the sun begins to sink behind the crooked thatched roofs, staining everything in a murky gold that makes even the chickens look suspicious. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, mixed with something you cannot identify, which feels like a warning in itself. A group of villagers pauses, mid-conversation, the moment you appear, staring at you with the same expression people use when they are deciding whether you are lost, dangerous, or both. Then an old man with a beard that seems to have grown out of spite waves you over and tells you in a low voice that you should not stay outside after dark. His tone carries the weight of someone who has repeated this warning too many times to travelers who did not listen. You follow him to the center of the village as he hobbles along with surprising speed. He explains that strangers roam the fields at night, figures that do not speak or carry lanterns, figures who move with an odd, gliding stride that no human should manage. You glance around, half expecting someone to laugh and reveal a joke, but every villager within earshot nods grimly. One woman, clutching a basket of turnips, tells you she once heard footsteps behind her after dusk, only to discover no one there when she turned around. Yet the footsteps continued for several moments, as if whatever followed her had not gotten the message. Another villager claims his dog refuses to leave the house at night, and he trusts the dog more than half the people he drinks with. As you continue walking, you study the village. Doors are reinforced with extra beams. Windows are shuttered the moment the sun dips below the tree line, and even the children speak in hushed voices. Every surface seems to carry faint scratches, as though someone or something has tried to claw its way inside. You tell yourself they are probably marks from tools, but the grooves are too high, too sharp, too deliberate. A young shepherd gestures toward the fields and tells you he once saw silhouettes moving between the barley stalks, long after everyone should have been in bed. He insists they were taller than ordinary men, and too still, almost as if waiting. Night falls faster than you expect. A breeze rolls through the village carrying the metallic scent of the river and something colder beneath it. You see families herding their children indoors with the frantic efficiency of people who have practiced this routine countless times. Doors close one after another with loud thuds, shutters slam, and the village transforms from a lively settlement into a collection of barricaded shelters. A lantern flickers in a nearby house, and for a moment you see a woman crossing herself repeatedly, whispering prayers that sound much older than the church would approve of. You decide to stay outside a moment longer, partly out of curiosity and partly because you do not yet feel the fear that governs these villagers. That changes when the sounds begin. At first it is only the rustling of leaves, then the faint crunch of something moving across the dirt path. You search the shadows, heart beginning to pound, but the darkness feels heavy, as if hiding more than empty air. A distant shape glides past the edge of your vision, tall and slow, too smooth to be human. When you blink, it is gone. The silence that follows is worse than any noise could have been. It wraps around you like a cold hand closing over your throat. A villager cracks open his door and hisses at you to get inside before you attract attention. When you finally step into the safety of his cramped cottage, he bars the door immediately, layering wooden beams across it with a speed that implies practice. Inside, the family sits silently around the hearth, listening to something outside move past the walls. The scraping sound is faint yet unmistakable, like fingers brushing against stone. No one breathes until it fades into the night. Centuries later, long after these villagers crumble into folklore, archaeologists dig through the hills surrounding this once forgotten settlement. They find evidence of camps belonging to travelers whose presence does not match any known migration pattern, groups who pass through under cover of darkness. Tools heavier than local craftsmanship, footprints larger than common villagers, and remnants of rituals that suggest the strangers were not merely passing by but watching. Scholars publish their findings and declare that the villagers had good reason to be cautious, that their fear was not superstition but instinct. And as you leave the village at dawn, the fields shimmer softly under the early light, looking ordinary and harmless. Yet you cannot shake the memory of that silhouette drifting through the barley. The villagers warned you about strangers at night, and now you understand that sometimes the oldest fears are simply truths waiting for the right century to be believed. You hear the rumor first in a drafty hall, where servants pretend not to gossip while absolutely gossiping. They pass the story around like a hot loaf of bread, dropping their voices only when someone important walks by. A royal poisoning, they say, whispered with the theatrical flair of people who wish they were not terrified. According to them, the queen's uncle fell ill after a feast, collapsing dramatically into a bowl of pottage that had already been questionable before. He added his face to it. Some claim his fingers turned the color of bruised plums. Others insist he began reciting psalms backward. One swears blind he grew briefly convinced the tapestry lions were judging him. It is a messy tale, yet the court treats it as nothing more than the usual slander that trails behind noble families like smoke behind a poorly extinguished torch. You watch the nobles glide through the corridors with their trained smiles, every expression practiced and polished. They dismiss the poisoning story with the same wave they use for flies, claiming that the uncle was old, prone to indulgence, and dramatically allergic to shellfish. They insist the whole kingdom knows he would rather die than stop overeating. Behind these reassurances, though, you sense a thin layer of strain, a tension buried beneath courtesy. A few courtiers speak a little too quickly, their laughs, ringing slightly too bright, like bells cracked just enough to sound wrong. One lady claims the rumor was started by jealous rivals. Another says it is a misunderstanding created by the cooks. A third states confidently that the uncle fainted due to the weather, though the weather that day was simply existing. You wander deeper into the palace, where whispers grow smaller and more pointed. In the kitchens, the staff scrub pots with frantic intensity, as though trying to erase evidence no one has actually accused them of hiding. The head cook denies everything before you even open your mouth, loudly proclaiming that each dish was tasted thoroughly and that no treacherous herbs crossed his threshold. He lists ingredients with such precision that you suspect he rehearsed this speech in the pantry. Meanwhile, a scullery boy quietly admits he saw someone near the feast table who, we should not have been there, a figure moving like a shadow disguised poorly as a servant. Before you can press him, he is yanked away by a senior attendant who smiles too widely and tells you children imagine things at night. You step into the great hall where the feast took place. The air still holds the fading scent of roasted meat, spilled wine, and the lingering embarrassment of nobles who pretend no scandal has ever touched them. The long table gleams, wiped spotless, but you notice a small crack in the wood near the uncle's seat, a fissure where something oily might have dripped. A servant rushes over and places a platter on it as if trying to hide the mark. The gesture feels subtle, but not subtle enough. As the days pass, the uncle's condition worsens. He lies in his chamber, muttering incoherently, surrounded by physicians who argue about whether he is experiencing divine punishment, natural illness, or something involving toxins that none of them want to name out loud. The royal clerk writes updates that say nothing useful, carefully avoiding details. You hear the queen sigh whenever news arrives, her face clouded not with grief, but with calculation. It becomes clear that in this court, even tragedy must wait its turn behind politics. Then the uncle dies, quietly and inconveniently. A public announcement calls it a peaceful passing due to age. The servants murmur that he simply overindulged. The nobles pretend to mourn, while secretly adjusting alliances. The rumor of poisoning still circulates, but now it is dismissed more aggressively. Anyone who mentions it is accused of disrespect, or worse, a lack of loyalty. The story fades like smoke, dissipating in a drafty corridor. Centuries later, scholars sift through the royal archives, dusting off scrolls and letters that once lived in guarded chests. They find the personal notes of the royal physician who dared not speak honestly during his lifetime. In his cramped handwriting appears the silent truth. Traces of aconite detected, symptoms consistent with deliberate poisoning, orders from above to maintain discretion. Another record reveals a payment made discreetly to a noble family whose ambitions flourished shortly after the uncle's demise. And hidden among the queen's correspondence lies a coded letter requesting a remedy that matches the description of the poison used. The rumor the court mocked now stands proven. Each record stitching together a quiet crime that shaped the kingdom more than any battle. Back in the palace corridors where you once walked, the truth feels like a ghost stepping out from behind the embroidered curtains, weary of being ignored. The slander, everyone dismissed, turns out to be the one thing no one should have doubted. You sit beside the merchants in a smoky roadside tavern where the air is so thick with spice and gossip that you feel as if you should be paying an entrance fee. They crowd around a wooden table that wobbles with every boisterous laugh, their cloaks dusted with the smells of distant markets and questionable travel choices. Barrels of pepper sit stacked behind them, but no one talks about pepper. Instead, they trade secrets with the same enthusiasm other people reserve for dice games. A merchant with a beard that looks like it invented trade routes leans close and tells you that secrets are the only goods that always sell, even when crops fail. Another slaps the table and boasts that he once carried a message worth more than his entire caravan. He does not specify who paid him, which somehow makes the story worse. You listen as they describe coded rumors that pass from city to city like contraband. A woman selling saffron claims she knows which lord is quietly building an army. A silk trader swears he has proof that a bishop is heavily invested in smuggling. A spice dealer insists that a particular noble family keeps disappearing for long stretches, always returning with too much money and far too little explanation. Each tale sounds exaggerated, yet every merchant nods as though hearing familiar news, the kind that travels faster than horses and twice as quietly. They speak in layered phrases, part truth, part embellishment, part performance, crafted to lure you in deeper. One merchant, quieter than the rest, sits with his hands folded as though guarding something fragile. He watches you long enough to decide whether you are trustworthy or merely bored, then finally offers a tale that steals the room's attention. He tells of a hidden ledger kept by a powerful guild, a book said to contain evidence of illegal agreements, bribes, secret alliances, and payments to people who would deny having pockets. According to him, the ledger vanished decades ago after a rival accused the guild of fraud. The guild denied everything, of course. Everyone always denies everything. But the merchant swears that professionals were hired to track the ledger down, and they failed so thoroughly that their failure became a cautionary tale told to apprentices who imagined themselves clever. The other merchants lean in as he speaks, their expressions flickering with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He describes overhearing men in a southern port whispering that the ledger is hidden in a monastery vault. Another rumor claims a noble bought it to blackmail half the kingdom. A third insists the book was smuggled across the sea, sold to scholars who had no idea what they were purchasing. The details shift with each retelling, but the core remains the same. A book filled with dangerous truths exists, and someone has gone to great lengths to make sure it stays buried. The merchant takes a slow sip of wine and shrugs as if he has simply recited weather predictions. You leave the tavern that night, with the story echoing in your mind, wondering how much was theatrical flourish and how much was the sort of truth people prefer not to acknowledge. Travelers continue to pass through the area, spreading versions of the tale to anyone who will listen. Some add new twists, others insist parts have been confirmed by people who should not know anything. The rumor becomes a living thing, gathering influence as it drifts across trade routes and creeping into a priest, the ears of nobles, clergy, and thieves alike. Centuries later, in a fluorescent-lit archive where modern scholars sift through documents with gloved hands and magnifying lamps, a dusty box is opened. Inside lies a damaged ledger, its binding cracked, its ink faded but unmistakably present. As pages are examined, the scribbles and signatures match references from old guild records. Hidden agreements surface. Transactions long denied appear in crisp, damning rows. Every secret the merchant hinted at becomes a tangible truth, so detailed that investigators launch a full inquiry into historical corruption that stretches farther than anyone expected. In the quiet of the archive, the scholars laugh softly at the irony. The medieval merchants, dramatic as they were, had been right all along. Their fireside rumor becomes evidence in a modern investigation, shaping reports and academic papers with the same force that once shaped gossip in that smoky tavern. And as you recall, those merchants arguing over cinnamon prices, while casually revealing a conspiracy that would echo into the future, you realize that sometimes the most valuable cargo on a trade route is not spice, silk, or coin. It is the truth disguised as a story told between friends who know better than to write anything down. You first hear the whispers in a monastery courtyard, where the breeze smells faintly of old stone and the kind of incense that clings to your clothes for days. Monks shuffle past, to you with their usual air of solemn devotion, but today their conversations feel different. Quiet, clipped, too cautious. You catch phrases that sound like fragments of a larger secret, hints of a brotherhood hiding within the monastery itself. a group so discreet that even most monks do not realize who belongs to it. The idea seems absurd, because monks already live in a place where secrets should have the life expectancy of a snowflake landing on a fire. Yet the unease in their voices suggests something more substantial. You follow two monks walking toward the cloisters, pretending to admire the architecture while leaning just close enough to hear. They speak of brothers who attend prayers but sit slightly apart, men who take different paths through the monastery grounds, avoiding torchlit corridors as if trained to map the shadows. One monk swears that at least 3 brethren meet, after Compline, long after everyone should be asleep, convening in a chamber supposedly sealed centuries ago. Another insists they communicate with gestures that look like casual scratches or signs of fatigue, but carry deeper meaning. Their whispers paint a picture of a monastery, layered like an onion, faith on the outside, and something far more intricate beneath. You step into the refectory, where dozens of monks eat in disciplined silence, the only sounds the scrape of wooden spoons against bowls. Yet as you scan the long tables, you notice a pattern. Certain monks sit in fixed positions, always evenly spaced, never drawing attention. They move with a quiet certainty that feels almost rehearsed, as if they expect someone to be watching. Their robes are the same as everyone else's, but their posture, their alertness, their perfectly measured glances suggest they belong to a world just beneath the surface of the one they display. Later, in the scriptorium, you find an elderly monk copying a devotional text with steady hands. He works with the solemn grace of someone who has done this for decades, but his eyes flick upward when the room grows too quiet. You lean toward him and ask gently about the brotherhood. His quill stops mid-stroke. He does not speak. Instead, he closes the manuscript, folds his hands, and mutters a prayer that sounds hastily assembled. You try again, and he sighs, as if weary of carrying a burden he is not allowed to set down. He warns you that some vows bind tighter than ropes, and some knowledge is not meant for those who have not taken them. Then he rises and retreats into the stacks, leaving behind an ink blot that spreads slowly across the parchment. You explore the monastery further, drifting through narrow corridors where candles burn low and shadows stretch like long fingers. A staircase spirals downward into a chamber that should be empty according to the map you saw earlier. Instead, you find faint footprints in the dust, fresher than they should be. Symbols carved into the stones catch the candlelight, simple markings that an ordinary visitor might dismiss as construction scratches. But when you crouch closer, you notice they repeat with intention, forming a discrete pattern winding across the wall like a hidden trail. As you return to the courtyard, a young monk approaches you hesitantly. He glances around, ensuring no one is watching, and whispers that the Brotherhood protects something older than the monastery itself. He refuses to explain further, but the tremor in his voice tells you he is not exaggerating. Before you can ask more, the abbot appears, and the young monk retreats instantly, disappearing into the procession heading toward the chapel. The abbot gives you a polite smile that feels more like a warning than a greeting. Centuries pass, and the truth waits patiently in dust and ink. In a climate-controlled archive beneath Rome, scholars unroll papal documents long hidden from public view. They find letters, sealed and forgotten, that mention a quiet brotherhood allowed to operate in certain monasteries for purposes deliberately left vague. There are references to secret correspondences, coded instructions, and permissions granted only to monks trained for discreet missions. Footnotes hint at a network stretching across Europe, staffed by brothers who swore dual vows, one to God and one to the unseen. The scholars stare at these revelations with the awe of people watching history step out of its own shadow. The clandestine brotherhood the monks whispered about was real, its mission woven silently through the fabric of medieval faith. And as you remember the silent glances, the strange symbols, the monks who moved like men with two lives, you realize the truth was always there, hidden in plain sight, just as they intended. You arrive at the construction site before dawn, stepping into a world that smells of dust, wet mortar, and the kind of ambition that makes men believe they can impress both kings and saints at the same time. The half-built cathedral towers above you like the skeleton of some ancient beast, ribs of stone arching toward the pale morning sky. Masons and laborers shuffle in with sleepy determination, carrying tools that look older than their grandfathers. You stand near the scaffolding where a master builder, wrapped in a cloak dusted white with limestone, studies a block of stone as if it has personally challenged him to a duel. He is carving something small on the underside of the block, something most people would never see. At first you assume it is a simple mason's mark, one of those practical symbols used to track who did what. But the longer you watch, the stranger it becomes. The shape is too intricate, a spiral twisting into a symbol that looks part alphabet, part constellation. He carves with steady precision, glancing over his shoulder every few moments as though afraid someone might notice. You try to look uninterested, but the cold breeze and your own curiosity betray you. He catches your eye, hesitates, then casually places his hand over the carving as if covering a spill. When he rolls the stone into place, the symbol faces inward, destined to be hidden forever once mortar seals it. You ask him what it means, and he shrugs with a smile, a little too polite, the kind that people use when they are lying in a way they hope you admire. He mutters something about tradition before instructing an apprentice to fetch another block. The apprentice scurries off, whispering a prayer under his breath that sounds suspiciously nervous. You remain near the scaffolding long, enough to see the master builder carve another symbol on a different stone, this one resembling an angular knot. Again he hides it from view. Again he looks around with the hyper-awareness of someone participating in something he believes should stay unspoken. As the day moves on, you realize he is not alone. Several masons have their own symbols, each one unique, each one tucked away beneath arches or behind buttresses where only future mice or very determined archaeologists might find them. Some symbols repeat in curious patterns, forming invisible paths that wind along the cathedral's foundation. They are not decorated like the grand carvings meant for the public. They are discreet, almost reverent, placed where no ordinary eye will ever look. You begin to suspect that the cathedral is not merely being built, it is being encoded. During the midday meal, the workers gather to eat. Rough bread and cheese, speaking in low voices about the strange noises heard inside the unfinished nave at night. One says he saw candlelight flickering even when no one was supposed to be inside. Another claims he found a symbol carved into his workbench overnight, matching one the master builder had tried to erase earlier that week. They talk casually, but their glances are sharp, aware of something unspoken weaving through the stones. A few joke nervously that the builders are leaving messages for angels. Others mutter alternatives that involve less heaven and more shadow. You return at dusk, watching the workers pack up as the sky darkens to a deep indigo. The master builder remains behind to inspect the day's progress. You see him stand beneath a towering archway, touching one of the hidden carvings as though confirming it is still there. His fingers linger on the stone with a fondness that suggests meaning far beyond craftsmanship. When he walks away, he leaves the cathedral interior glowing faintly from the lone lantern he carries, the shadows dancing across unfinished walls like something alive and restless. Centuries pass, and the cathedral becomes a triumph of Gothic grandeur. Pilgrims marvel at its stained glass, nobles admire its spires, and no one notices the hundreds of hidden markings sealed within its bones. Not until restoration work begins, and historians crawl into forgotten corners, armed with notebooks, flashlights, and the kind of enthusiasm only academics can sustain. They uncover the symbols one by one, tracing patterns the builders never intended anyone to see. Some symbols match ancient guild marks used by master masons who shared knowledge in secretive circles. Others correspond to star maps, aligning with specific constellations at certain times of year. A few appear to be coded messages, referencing architectural techniques withheld from rivals. And one set of markings, repeated in a spiral near the foundation, appears to be a silent prayer for protection, carved in a script older than the cathedral itself. The historians publish papers, debate theories, and marvel at the ingenuity of men who worked in silence beneath a world that never thought to look closely. Standing within the echoing nave, you recall the builder's careful hands, his sideways glances, and the quiet understanding shared among the masons. They were not just shaping stone. They were leaving a legacy meant to whisper through time. You meet the pilgrim on a sunburned road that winds through fields of half-grown grain and rumors that refuse to die. He limps slightly, leaning on a staff carved with tiny notches that might be prayers or debts. He never finished paying. His cloak smells of rain and old bread, and his expression carries the stubborn confidence of someone who has been ignored too many times to care anymore. When he tells you that a noble family is hiding an heir who should have been dead or crowned or both, you assume he is. Just another traveler, fueled by cheap ale and righteous indignation. But the longer he speaks, the more the air changes, as though the dust itself pauses to listen. He describes the noble house in question with the accuracy of a man who has stared at its crest from the shadows. A proud family, always smiling too widely, always donating just enough coin to the church to stay on the good side of both heaven and gossip. They project virtue the way hawks project confidence before stealing chickens. The pilgrim says their lineage is a river with one branch they desperately pretend never existed. A bastard, a survivor, a child born in the wrong room at the wrong hour. He claims to know where that child was hidden, who raised them, and why the family still fears their return. Your first instinct is to dismiss him, but his story is too detailed to be drunken invention. He knows the precise night a servant vanished. He recalls a wet nurse found mysteriously wealthy years later. He even names the remote monastery where he believes the child grew into adulthood, sheltered behind stone walls and commandments about silence. You follow him along the dusty road because something in his voice carries the weight of a man who wants the truth known, even if no one thanks him for it. When you reach the outskirts of the noble estate, the pilgrim stops beneath an ancient oak and points at the manor rising beyond it. He tells you everything you need to know about the family without speaking a word. You see the polished gardens, the servants rushing with trays, and the noble banners fluttering in the breeze. The place smells of money, old secrets, and an uncomfortable amount of rosewater. The pilgrim watches the house with narrowed eyes, as if waiting for someone to emerge and confess. For days you observe the estate from a distance. You notice odd things. A young knight who resembles both the lord and the lady in small, impossible ways, yet is never named among their children. A steward who flinches at questions about genealogy. A scribe who keeps the family. Archives locked with more keys than the average prison. The kind of details that seem harmless until they stack into something heavy. The pilgrim grows increasingly certain. He tells you that the hidden child was older than the current heir, that they were born before the marriage was sanctified, and that the family has spent decades rewriting their own history to protect their power. At night, he recreates scenes with dramatic hand gestures that make passing shepherds quietly adjust their route. You begin to feel the tension of a truth pressing against the edges of a lie that has gone, brittle with age. Years slip by after your strange partnership with the pilgrim, years in which your memory of him becomes layered with dust and the faint smell of his travel-worn cloak. You hear whispers occasionally, stories from monks, traders, and bored tavern-goers who enjoy weaving history with speculation. They claim that scholars have unearthed new evidence in the noble family's archives, a birth record hidden behind the page of a saint's genealogy, a letter from the old midwife who disappeared long ago, a confession written in shaky ink by a guilt-ridden steward who wanted absolution more than loyalty. Then the official announcement arrives, delivered by sober clerks who speak as if their lives may depend on each syllable. The noble family tree has been updated, a new branch added, a name resurrected, an heir acknowledged long after it mattered to thrones or inheritances. You can almost feel the pilgrim grinning from whatever dusty road he now wanders, vindicated at last. The manor's current lord tries to soften the revelation by calling it a historical correction, a simple clerical oversight, as though someone misplaced a cousin rather than an entire human life. The public laughs politely, but the truth spreads faster than damage control can contain it. Bards turn the story into songs. Clerics debate its moral implications. Villagers retell it with varying levels of dramatic flair, usually involving suspicious midwives and babies swapped, like festival pastries. Scholars, of course, simply nod, delighted to have another footnote to argue about. As for you, you remember the pilgrim's certainty, the way he traced the invisible cracks in a family's carefully curated legacy. You recall the suspicion in his eyes as he stared at that grand estate, seeing through its polished veneer to the flawed humanity beneath. And you understand something the noble family never did. A hidden truth is only ever borrowed. Eventually, someone comes to collect it. The market greets you with the smell of roasted onions, damp wool, and the unmistakable scent of too many people pretending they are not selling anything illegal. Stalls press shoulder to shoulder like gossiping neighbors, their canvas roofs flapping in a breeze that carries every rumor in the known world. You pass a butcher shouting about fresh cuts that are suspiciously small for the sheep he claims they came from, a tanner who smells like despair, marinated in vinegar, and a brewer proudly offering ale that could double as paint remover. Then you reach the astrologers, and the air shifts. It always does around people who insist the stars have opinions. They sit in, a cluster near the fountain, draped in dark robes, lined with cheap embroidery, meant to look mystical. Their tables are cluttered with astrolabes, wax candles, and scrolls so worn you suspect they have been rolled and unrolled since the last comet passed by. From a distance they look theatrical, the sort of people who thrive on vague pronouncements that can be interpreted 6 different ways. But the closer you get, the more serious their clients become. Merchants lean in with furrowed brows. Knights remove their helmets and listen without mockery. Even nuns hover nearby, their faces stern yet undeniably curious. One astrologer catches your attention. He is older than the rest, his beard streaked with the gray of someone who has been right more often than people would prefer. When he speaks, crowds press in, not for entertainment, but for confirmation of fears they have tried to bury. You edge closer, pretending to admire a set of star charts while really listening to the predictions spilling softly from his mouth. He speaks of a noble advisor who will be betrayed by his own steward within weeks. He warns that a minor baron will be arrested for treason on the 3rd full moon, though no one yet suspects him of anything more sinister than overcooking his venison. He predicts a royal messenger will vanish on the road north, causing a diplomatic disaster between 2 lords who barely tolerate speaking to each other even when the messages arrive intact. People murmur nervously, but the old astrologer simply meets their eyes and says fate has a method. You get the uneasy sense he is not guessing. His voice lacks the flamboyant confidence of a showman. He sounds tired, almost bored, like a man who has spent too long arguing with destiny and finally resigned himself to losing. You spend the day weaving through the market, but the astrologers linger in your thoughts. You try to shrug off their claims as medieval showmanship, the kind of entertainment villagers flock to because it is cheaper than theater and more dramatic than sermons. Yet a week later, rumors ripple through town. A noble advisor has been arrested under accusations of conspiracy after his steward anonymously delivered documents to the royal court. The baron, the one no one suspected, suddenly finds himself protected by soldiers who seem to be guarding him from threats not yet named, and the royal messenger, the one destined for the northern road, never arrives at his destination. His horse returns without a rider and with a saddlebag torn open, as though someone needed to steal something too quickly to care about neatness. People remember the astrologers. They whisper in corners, glancing upward at the sky with a new caution, as if the stars themselves might be eavesdropping. Merchants begin to ask the older astrologer for advice before agreeing to new trade routes. Knights consult him before traveling. Even the local lord sends a servant to inquire about auspicious days for negotiations. You return to the market often, half expecting to find the astrologers gone, chased out by fearful townsfolk, or hauled off by someone who does not appreciate destiny being broadcast like market gossip. But they remain, sitting calmly by the fountain as though nothing extraordinary has happened. One afternoon, you gather the courage to ask the old astrologer how he knows such things. He studies your face for a long moment, then gestures for you to sit. He explains that the stars do not decide human actions. They only nudge, whisper, and illuminate the paths people already lean toward. He says rulers in particular shine like torches in the night sky, their choices visible long before they make them. You wonder whether he truly believes this, or whether it is simply a poetic way of saying power leaves fingerprints. Either way, his predictions continue to unfold with unsettling accuracy. Decades later, historians pore over letters, diaries, and court records. They find references to the astrologers, notes scribbled by courtiers acknowledging their warnings, even confessions written by those who carried out the plots. Evidence piles up like old stones, revealing a foundation long forgotten. And the scholars, normally allergic to drama, begin to whisper that perhaps those astrologers were not charlatans at all. They were observers, interpreters, men who read patterns that everyone else mistook for coincidence. You remember the old astrologer's steady gaze, the crowd leaning in, the quiet certainty in his voice. You recall how the marketplace felt like a crossroads, where the mundane and the uncanny mingled beneath the same canvas roofs, and you realize the truth that medieval minds knew instinctively. Sometimes prophecy is just a careful reading of the world, and sometimes the world is more predictable than anyone wants to admit. You fall in with the travelers on a dirt road pitted by wagon wheels and old sins. Their cloaks flap in the wind, patched and mismatched, each one carrying the smell of smoke, horse sweat, and the faint perfume of people who have not bathed since the last saint's feast day. They speak in low voices, trading rumors the way merchants trade coins. And it does not take long before you hear the name of a bishop spoken with more venom than reverence. You slow your pace just enough to listen, because whenever medieval travelers whisper, it usually means the truth is taking off its gloves. They describe a bishop whose robes shimmer with gold thread stolen from church coffers, whose rings could pay for a dozen peasants' fields, and whose piety lasts exactly as long as the nearest noblewoman's husband is out of town. One traveler, a wiry man with a laugh that sounds like a cough pretending to be cheerful, claims the bishop also keeps a cellar full of wine confiscated under the noble banner of moral discipline. Another whispers that the bishop charges pilgrims donations to pray at. Relics so questionable they might as well be labeled assorted saintly leftovers. You try not to stare, but your curiosity betrays you. The travelers grin knowingly, because no one walks in the Middle Ages without stumbling over a corrupt cleric, sooner or later. It is practically a rite of passage, like learning that bread can also double as a weapon if stale enough. As the road winds between hedges and fields, the accusations grow more detailed. A widow who lost her home because she could not pay the bishop's new alms tax. A scribe dismissed for copying a sermon that exposed too much truth. A knight denied burial for his father until he offered the bishop a purse heavy enough to make forgiveness fashionable. By the time you make camp at dusk, the fire crackles with more tension than warmth. The travelers settle on logs and overturned crates, passing around a stale loaf of bread that flakes like ancient plaster. Shadows dance on their faces as they lean closer, lowering their voices until the night seems to lean in as well. One traveler tells a story of coins hidden beneath the bishop's chambers, sealed behind a stone only he knows how to unlock. Another swears the bishop has been trading relics with foreign lords for political favors. They speak of bribes, stolen tithes, rigged trials, and punishments designed not for sinners but for anyone who questions him. As they talk, you glance up at the stars. They shimmer indifferently, as though the heavens have seen too many schemes to bother reacting anymore. You wonder how a man tasked with shepherding souls could stray this far from the flock. But the travelers only shrug. Bishops, they say, are like apples in a barrel. The rot spreads quietly until someone finally gathers the courage to lift the top layer. The next morning, you reach a small town where the bishop's influence hangs in the air like the scent of incense that has been burned too long. Ordinary people bow their heads when speaking of him, not out of devotion but out of fear that the church doors might close in their faces. You see a woman clutching her rosary as though it is a shield, and a merchant who visibly winces when someone mentions tithes. The bishop's palace rises above the town like a smug reminder of who owns what and why. Questioning it is hazardous to your continued breathing. You continue your journey long after the travelers depart, but their whispered accusations cling to you like dust. You expect the stories to fade into rumors, easily dismissed or exaggerated into folk tales. Instead, decades later, you watch historians pore over newly uncovered ledgers, letters, and court records. They find accounting books with numbers that do not add up unless one assumes the bishop had expensive tastes and very creative theology. They find correspondence revealing bribes disguised as pilgrim gifts. They discover complaints filed by clergy who were silenced, punished, or conveniently reassigned to remote parishes where their ability to speak out was limited to yelling at sheep. The confirmation comes piece by piece, each document a stone contributing to a monument of hypocrisy. Even church officials, centuries removed from the fire of scandal, reluctantly acknowledge that the accusations were true. The bishop was corrupt, cunning, and well-connected. The kind of man who could turn confession into a business opportunity. You remember the travelers, their weary eyes and bitter voices, the way they spoke truth in whispers because speaking it loudly would have put them in chains. You recall the crackling fire, the shared bread, the stories too detailed to be inventions of bored wanderers. And you realize they were not just airing grievances, they were preserving history before anyone with authority cared to write it down. Truth, after all, has a habit of traveling on foot long before it ever reaches a scholar's desk. The tavern is packed with the usual assortment of weary laborers, suspicious merchants, and one man who looks like he has been glaring at the same mug of ale for 3 hours, waiting for it to apologize. You slip inside to escape the cold, only to find the heat inside unbearable, thick with smoke, sweat, and the unmistakable perfume of roasted turnips. A lute plays in the corner, badly. A barmaid shouts for someone to stop singing unless they intend to finish in the same key they started. It is chaos in the comfortable, familiar, medieval way. You take a seat near the hearth, close enough to warm your legs, but far enough not to get singed when someone inevitably tosses a log too enthusiastically. The table beside you holds 3 grain merchants deep in their cups, their cloaks still dusted with flour from the day's work. At first, their conversation sounds like ordinary complaints about taxes, weather, and the mysterious ability of rats to chew through reinforced barrels as though auditioning for sainthood. But then their voices dip lower, their eyes narrow, and the real conversation begins. They speak of a shadow group, a collection of men who meet at night in a barn owned by no one officially and everyone unofficially. They trade no coins, sign no contracts, and leave behind no written trace, at least nothing obvious. Yet somehow they decide exactly how much grain will be released to the markets each month. They control prices, shortages, and the inconvenient appearance of famine panic. One merchant calls them the Council of Sacks, which sounds ridiculous enough to be true. Another insists they have a secret symbol, a carved wheat stalk hidden beneath the loose plank of a granary floor. You try not to, laugh, but the way they whisper makes it clear they are not joking. Outside the tavern the wind rattles shutters, but inside the room seems to tighten around their words. The men describe how prices leap or plummet with unnatural precision, how merchants who do not cooperate find their shipments mysteriously delayed or damaged, how a miller who refused their arrangement discovered his millstone cracked clean in half, something no one had seen before or since. They say the group has ears everywhere, even in taverns, which makes you sit a little straighter and pretend your stew is more interesting than it is. The barkeep wanders by, wiping his hands on a cloth that should have been retired a decade ago, and joins the conversation long enough to mutter that the group has been buying influence with certain officials. A tax inspector who suddenly owns a larger house. A reeve who now wears finer boots than his lord. A priest who preaches suspiciously often about the holiness of patience during shortages. The merchants nod grimly, carving lines in the table with their knives as if tracing the invisible reach of the conspiracy. You leave the tavern that night with the uneasy sense that something in the market stalls is being pulled by invisible strings. You watch farmers haul sacks across muddy streets, unaware that the value of their labor is being decided by men they will never meet. You see bakers counting coins and arguing with suppliers, unaware that the price of grain was chosen weeks before they even woke that morning. The rumors cling to your thoughts like burrs on wool. Time passes, and the conspiracy becomes one of those half-remembered tales you repeat only when the night is long and the fire is slow to burn. You assume it was tavern exaggeration, the kind that grows wild in dim rooms full of ale. Then, long after the merchants' voices have faded from memory, scholars digging through abandoned farmhouses and forgotten estates uncover something that makes you sit up straighter than a monk caught dozing during Mass. Ledgers, stacks of them, bound in cracked leather, filled with coded entries listing grain yields, false deficits, bribes disguised as charitable donations, and careful notes about which villages should receive shipments and which should mysteriously starve for a season. Historians piece together meeting records marked only with symbols. They reconstruct price manipulations spanning decades, designed not to help communities, but to enrich a few men who played the grain market like puppeteers. The Council of Sacks was real. Their influence stretched farther than any drunk merchant ever guessed. Entire regions bent to their secret policies, and the common folk never knew why bread became scarce one year and cheap the next. The conspiracy you once heard, whispered between spilled ale and cracked mugs, now sits documented in cold, unforgiving ink. You remember the tavern, the dim firelight flickering across uneasy faces, the merchants' hushed voices painting a portrait of greed hidden behind burlap and wheat. They seemed paranoid at the time, but in hindsight they were simply observant. They saw the edges of a truth too large and dangerous to speak openly, and you realize something every traveler eventually learns. Tavern talk may be messy, but sometimes it is the first draft of history. You hear about the night rider long before you see the village he torments. The rumor drifts along the road like smoke, carried by peddlers who refuse to stop walking after sunset and shepherds who hurry their flocks home, as if wolves have suddenly mastered strategy. By the time you reach the edge of the village, you have pieced together a vague portrait of a mounted figure who appears after dark, cloaked, silent, and apparently convinced that fear is a reasonable form of taxation. The village itself looks ordinary enough in daylight. Goats graze lazily, Children chase each other with sticks, and the blacksmith hammers iron with the determination of someone settling a personal vendetta against metal. But when the sun begins to dip, something in the air changes. Doors slam, shutters rattle into place. Even the chickens hurry inside their coops with suspicious urgency. You barely have time to blink before the entire settlement folds into itself, as if rehearsing a ritual perfected through terror. An old woman grips your sleeve and demands to know whether you have arrived to help or to join the days. Night Rider. It is a disturbing question, softened only slightly by the fact that she squints through one eye, as though trying to determine whether you resemble a criminal or just a fool. When you assure her you are neither, she pulls you toward her cottage with the force of someone half her age. Inside, her family huddles around the hearth. They warn you that no one travels the road after sundown, not unless they want to meet the rider and hand over whatever coins or supplies they hope to keep. You listen as they explain the pattern. He rides in on a dark horse that seems carved out of shadow, never speaking but always knowing exactly which homes can afford to pay him. Some villagers believe he is a nobleman whose lands have grown barren. Others claim he is a mercenary turned brigand. One farmer swears the rider is in league with the local reeve, dividing the profits like two rats feasting from the same silo. No one knows the truth, but everyone agrees on the same detail. He always returns, and he always takes more than he did before. Night falls too quickly, as though the sun itself wants no part of this situation. The village becomes eerily quiet. You hear only the crackling of the hearth and the shifting of nervous feet on wooden floors. Then, somewhere in the distance, a horse snorts. The old woman gasps. Her grandson covers his ears. Even the dog crawls beneath the table with the look of someone re-evaluating every decision that led it to this point. You inch toward the shutter and peer through a narrow crack. A lone figure moves down the road, cloak fluttering like a torn banner. He carries a torch that flickers madly, casting wild shadows that make the cottages look like they are flinching. He stops at a house, raises one gloved hand, and the door opens without argument. A pouch changes hands. The rider does not thank them or threaten them. He simply moves on, the horse's hooves muffled as if the earth itself has learned to cooperate with him. The old woman whispers that he comes every fortnight, and if a village cannot pay, livestock vanish. Tools break overnight. A barn collapses under mysterious circumstances that never seem mysterious to those who understand his reach. It is extortion with the efficiency of a tax collector and the flair of a ghost story. You leave the village at dawn. The night rider already vanished, leaving behind the sort of tension that sticks to people longer than bruises. The villagers thank you for staying, even though you did nothing except witness their fear. They say sometimes it helps simply to have another person share the burden of knowing. Years later, when the kingdom changes, hands and royal scribes are ordered to organize centuries of records. Something remarkable surfaces, writs, dozens of them. Some written in hurried script, others stamped with official seals. They detail payments made to an unnamed agent tasked with collection of extraordinary dues from rural settlements. Attached lists match the very villages you visited. There are complaints from sheriffs about a horseman demanding fees they never authorized. Reports of peasants driven to poverty. Notes about grain seized under pretense of royal need. And instructions from a noble lord who expected silence in exchange for gold. The night rider was not a legend. He was an agent of a quiet, sanctioned extortion scheme that thrived beneath the surface of official governance. A ghost backed by paperwork. You remember the villagers' trembling voices, the torchlight flickering across that silent rider, and the way fear seeped into every corner of the night. And you understand that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones with signatures. The castle looms above you like a stone giant trying to pretend it is not hiding anything suspicious, which only makes it more suspicious. Its Towers stab into the sky at angles that suggest architects in the Middle Ages occasionally let enthusiasm win over geometry. From the outside, it looks like any fortress built to withstand sieges, storms, and the questionable decisions of its own lords. But the villagers you pass on the winding road keep giving you knowing looks, the kind that say they are delighted to share a rumor while also refusing to elaborate. The whispers agree on only one point. The castle has a tunnel no one has ever seen, but everyone swears exists, because a fortress of this size would be incomplete without at least one architectural secret meant to impress future generations of gossipers. Inside the outer courtyard, the air carries the scent of hay, sweat, and damp stone that never dries completely, no matter how much the sun tries. Guards patrol with impressive sternness, though a few have the distant stare of men who would rather be anywhere else. You wander among the stables, kitchens, and barracks, trying to look like someone studying architectural details instead of someone studying rumors. Servants pass by with baskets of bread and sacks of flour, muttering about drafty corridors and odd noises at night. One scullion tells you she heard footsteps beneath the floor while scrubbing the great hall. Another insists she once felt cold air rising from a corner of the cellar where no breeze should exist. Their stories are inconsistent, but the fear threading their voices feels unmistakably genuine. You step into the castle's main hall, where tapestries depict heroic battles in which the castle's former lords look suspiciously clean for men supposedly knee-deep in war. The floor beneath you is solid, heavy stone, yet when you tap your foot lightly, the echo travels farther than it should. You follow the faint vibration toward an alcove hidden behind a large statue of some long-forgotten noble. The stonework there is slightly mismatched, as if someone repaired it hastily. You crouch and run your hand along the wall, searching for a seam, a shift in texture, anything that might suggest a concealed entrance. You find nothing but dust, yet the sensation lingers that something watches you from below. A steward notices your interest and stiffens as though you have asked him to confess a crime. He assures you there is no tunnel, that the castle is as straightforward as its lord, which is not the endorsement he thinks it is. His smile stretches thin, like old parchment, and he ushers you away from the alcove with the enthusiasm of someone hiding an inconvenient truth. The more he insists, the more certain you become. Later you wander into the cellar, where barrels of ale line the walls, and the air tastes faintly of yeast and something colder beneath it. You move a few barrels aside and find a patch of stone that feels unnaturally cool, as though it separates you from a deeper chamber. You knock once, and the sound echoes with the hollow resonance of a space begging to be discovered. A servant appears abruptly and tells you this part of the cellar is off limits. She offers no explanation. Her eyes flick toward the floor, then back to you, silently pleading with you not to ask questions she cannot answer. Night brings more evidence. You lie awake in a guest chamber, listening to the castle settle into the kind of silence that only old buildings possess. Then you hear it, a faint scrape beneath the floorboards, a muted thud, the soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps where no corridor exists. You rise and place your palm against the dais floor. It vibrates gently, like a distant heartbeat. Whoever built this castle did not simply rely on walls and battlements. They built an escape route, a hiding place, or perhaps something more complicated than either. Centuries pass, and the castle falls into disrepair before scholars reclaim it, with enthusiasm bordering on reckless. Archaeologists arrive with their tools, lanterns, and unshakable belief that dirt is friend rather than foe. They map the structure, scan the ground beneath it, and eventually begin digging. What they uncover is not a simple tunnel, but an entire subterranean network. Hidden passageways snake beneath the foundations. Some lead to sealed chambers Others branch into long corridors that connect to distant outbuildings, wells, and escape routes leading deep into the forest. They find ladders, remnants of torches, and carved marks on the stone walls, indicating paths taken by people who needed to move unseen. A whole secret world sprawls beneath the castle, confirming every rumor whispered by villagers who never had proof but always had intuition. As you imagine those hidden corridors, the dusty echo of footsteps beneath your old guest room, the mismatched stones, and the frightened eyes of servants, the truth settles with thrilling clarity. You were walking above a shadow city the whole time. You notice the physician the moment you enter the village. He moves through the narrow streets like a man who knows exactly how much people depend on him and exactly how little they understand what he actually does. His cloak is cleaner than a medieval cloak has any right to be, and he carries a satchel filled with tools that make the local peasants stare as though he is part healer, part sorcerer, part menace. You watch him kneel beside a coughing farmer, place 2 fingers on the man's wrist, and murmur something under his breath. Then he mixes a powder into warm ale, hands it over, and within minutes the farmer stops hacking as if his lungs have suddenly remembered their job. You follow him throughout the day because the villagers insist he is either a blessing from the heavens or a problem waiting for one bad night to reveal itself. When he treats a child with a fever, he uses a small metal instrument to check her breath, examining her with concentration too intense to feel comforting. Her fever breaks by dusk, leaving her mother in tears of gratitude mixed with confusion. You see him mend a wounded soldier with a salve that smells like crushed herbs and something unfamiliar, something that makes the hair on your arms stand straight. The soldier sits up within the hour, looking more surprised than pleased. Healing in this world is supposed to be slow, messy, and unreliable. His results look suspiciously like competence. You corner him politely near the well after he has finished lecturing a group of peasants about cleanliness, which they listen to with the patience of people who have never been rewarded for washing anything except dishes. He speaks with unusual confidence for a medieval physician, offering explanations that sound half scientific, half alchemical riddle. He tells you he has studied herbs from distant lands. He insists he has learned new techniques from wandering scholars. When you press gently, asking why so many of his patients recover with uncanny speed, his smile tightens. He thanks you for your curiosity, then walks away as though he has remembered something urgent, possibly involving avoiding further questions. The villagers tell you strange things. After dark, they say he visits the graveyard at night. They say he requests animal carcasses from hunters for research. They say he once fixed a broken bone in such a peculiar way that the healed limb bent slightly differently, not worse, not better, just unsettlingly functional. A few mutter that no healer should know that much unless they learned it somewhere they should not have been. You try to dismiss their fears as the usual medieval suspicion of anything that works too well. But then you see the physician slip into an old barn at dusk. Lantern light flickers through the cracks in the wood, illuminating shapes you cannot quite interpret. When you step closer, you catch a glimpse of the physician bending over a table, instruments arranged on a cloth, something wrapped in linen at the center. His movements are precise, almost ritualistic, his hands steady in a way that suggests a level of practice that makes you uneasy. You hear the quiet rasp of metal, the soft murmur of notes he scribbles on parchment, and the troubling certainty that this is not treatment. This is study that feels far too deliberate. You do not confront him. Something in the barn's unnatural quiet advises against it. Instead, you leave the village the next morning with your thoughts swarming like flies around a wounded animal. You carry with you the image of the physician's steady hands, the quick recoveries, the too clean cloak, and the faint smell of strange herbs lingering in the air. Years pass. History moves on. The village changes hands. The barn collapses into ruin. But in a distant archive, illuminated by modern lanterns and scholarly enthusiasm, A stack of hidden documents surfaces. They contain notes written in the physician's distinctive hand, records of treatments conducted without consent, lists of patients grouped by symptoms, age, and resilience, annotations describing the effects of combinations of herbs used experimentally, diagrams of bodies, procedures attempted, results that make the archivists fall silent. There are letters from church officials warning him to cease his unnatural investigations, reports filed by concerned villagers, a confiscated journal revealing that some of his treatments worked only because he tested half a dozen versions on those too poor to refuse, discarding failures like spoiled ingredients. His brilliance had been real, so had the cost. You recall the villagers' awe, the whispered rumors, the strange glow in the barn. You remember how his patients recovered with improbable speed, and how he always looked slightly too pleased when they did. The truth settles heavily. The physician had been a healer, yes, but only because he first learned how to break things. You first see the queen from a distance, standing on a balcony where sunlight glints off her jewels in a way that suggests she would shine even without them. She carries herself with the rigid grace of someone who has learned that turning one's back, even for a breath, allows half the court to invent new crimes for her. Servants pass beneath her balcony with the nervous energy of people terrified of being noticed and equally terrified of not being noticed. Whispers chase her like persistent insects. You can almost hear them buzzing in the air as she moves from chamber to chamber, her smile polite, her eyes calculating, her posture so poised it looks painful. You follow her steps through the castle corridors, where tapestries hang heavy with heroic scenes that bear no resemblance to the current political climate. Courtiers bow as she passes, but their eyes flick sideways, trading unspoken accusations. They claim she manipulates the king. They claim she writes secret messages at night. They claim she hoards power like a dragon hoards gold, though the only thing she truly clutches is her dignity. You listen from behind a marble column as two ladies whisper that the queen hides meetings with foreign envoys. A steward mutters that she steals royal funds. A page swears he saw her slip into the tower during a thunderstorm, because obviously no queen would walk through rain unless planning treason. Yet you see none of this. What you do see is a woman who can barely finish a meal without being interrupted by someone needing approval for something tedious. You watch her soothe a frightened child, counsel a distraught noblewoman, and quiet a room full of bickering advisors with a single lifted finger. She moves like someone who has memorized every shadow in the castle, not because she fears what lurks there, but because she knows someone else does. Every smile she gives is deliberate. Every step is measured. Every breath feels like a silent negotiation. Over time, you notice the tension in her shoulders that never fully fades, the way she glances at the door before speaking, the way her hand occasionally hovers over her bodice, not for vanity but for reassurance, as though checking that something hidden beneath the silk is still where she left it. She keeps a small writing desk in a private chamber, its contents meticulously arranged. Late one evening you pass by the door and hear her voice, low, urgent, speaking to someone who replies in short whispers. When footsteps approach, the chamber falls silent with unnatural speed. The palace grows thicker with rumors. Courtiers swear she has been exchanging coded letters with a foreign king. Some claim she has arranged secret alliances. Others insist she hides a faction of loyalists ready to overthrow her rivals. The stories contradict each other wildly, but they keep spreading because a queen, surrounded by scandal, is far more entertaining than a queen doing her actual job. Even the king grows uneasy, questioning her decisions with increasing frequency, not out of distrust, but because distrust has been planted in him like a seed. One afternoon you catch her alone in the castle gardens, standing beneath an arch of ivy. Her shoulders sag for the first time, unburdened by courtly eyes. She looks older in that moment, not because of age, but because she carries the weight of a conspiracy she cannot name without sounding like she invented it. When a distant door slams, she straightens. Instantly, shoulders lifted, chin poised, armor restored. Years pass. The queen's reign ends, her name recorded in chronicles with careful neutrality. Scholars debate her legacy, while artists paint her with expressions that vary depending on whether they admired or despised her. She becomes a historical puzzle, neither villain nor saint, just a woman caught in a storm that history refuses to clearly define. Then the private letters surface. Found in a sealed chest, tucked behind centuries of debris, they reveal everything. Correspondence from nobles plotting against her, instructions to slander her reputation, plans to trap her politically, financially, and personally, notes from supposed allies promising loyalty while secretly supporting her enemies. There are her own letters as well, describing threats she could not speak aloud, choices made under duress, and fears that proved painfully justified. The conspiracy had been real, crafted carefully, executed quietly, and endured by a woman who had been accused of the very crimes used against her. Scholars pore over the letters with a mixture of fascination and guilt. Historians rewrite chapters. The scandal once blamed on her becomes a testament to her endurance. You remember the queen beneath the ivy, shoulders slumped in private, steel bright in public. You remember the whispers that clung to her like smoke, and you understand that she had never been the architect of scandal. She had been its target. You hear the story first in a village square, where a wandering minstrel strums a lute that has clearly endured more violence than music. His voice carries through the crowd like smoke, curling around the market stalls and drawing people closer with the promise of scandal wrapped in melody. The song speaks of a court official who vanished without warning, a man known for sharp quills, sharper wit, and an unfortunate talent for irritating powerful people. The minstrel's verses paint him as part hero, part nuisance, part mystery, and the villagers drink in every word, nodding as though they personally witnessed his disappearance, even though most of them struggle to remember what day it is. You follow the minstrel as he travels to the next town, curious how a simple melody can cling to your mind like burrs to wool. At the inn that night, he performs again, and this time he adds verses he did not sing before. The court official left the castle late one evening. He carried a satchel full of documents the king never wanted discussed. He argued with a noble whose smile never reached his eyes. There were footsteps in the corridor, an overturned candle, a cry heard only by those too afraid to repeat it. Then the trail went cold. The song grows somber as the minstrel sings of the search parties sent out, the river dredged, the forests combed, and the servants questioned until they invented confessions just to be released from the hall. Travelers at nearby tables exchange knowing glances. One claims the official fled with stolen gold. Another insists he was spirited away by foreign spies. A third swears he was seen walking along the coast months later, muttering about conspirators who watched him even from the waves. Every version contradicts the last, yet each one sounds plausible, enough to make you lean in closer. As the nights pass, you hear new minstrels sing the same tale, each adding flourishes to suit their audience. Some make the official a tragic lover, others turn him into a martyr. A few insist he was arrogant enough to believe truth alone could protect him. The melodies differ, but the core of the story remains. A disappearance that unsettled a kingdom, a man who walked into the shadows and did not return. You begin to notice something peculiar. The details that remain consistent between performances are not the dramatic ones, not the whispered conspiracies or the rivalries or the supposed forbidden romance. What persists are small things. The official's habit of scribbling notes obsessively, his long walks near the old boundary walls, his final day at court spent arguing with someone no minstrel can name. These quiet details feel heavier than the theatrics, as if the truth hides in the margins of the story. Months later, you arrive at the royal city, where the official once worked. His absence lingers in the corridors like a draft no builder has ever managed to seal. Courtiers speak of him cautiously, glancing around before admitting he had been troublesome. Some say he uncovered financial irregularities. Others claim he questioned the wrong noble about land disputes. A few insist he simply annoyed everyone equally, which in medieval politics is a dangerous talent. Time moves on. New officials take his place. Minstrels change their tunes. The tale becomes a story told on cold nights when the ale runs thin and someone remembers a verse or two. Then, long after the kingdom has forgotten the man, forensic workers digging near the old boundary walls uncover something buried in the earth. A scrap of cloth, embroidered with the royal insignia. A satchel containing fragmented parchment. Bones arranged in a way that does not suggest a peaceful end. The remains lie beside a collapsed section of tunnel once rumored to have been used for quiet discussions no one wanted recorded. The official never fled. He never reached the river or the coast. He died where he stood, then vanished only because someone wanted him erased entirely. Scholars piece together his final moments from the recovered documents. He had exposed a corruption scandal involving land rights, taxes, and the noble he argued with on the last day. His disappearance had been convenient, efficient, and executed with the sort of precision only someone inside the castle could manage. The discovery sparks more questions than answers, but it confirms one thing with chilling certainty. The minstrels had been right to sing. They were just missing the darkest verse. You arrive in the town just after midday, when the sun hangs high enough to illuminate the dust in the air, but not high enough to convince anyone to pretend things are normal. The streets are busier than you expect, yet every conversation seems to stop the moment you get close. Bakers pause mid-need. Merchants narrow their eyes as though checking whether you look like someone who pays taxes voluntarily. Even the children playing beside a well lower their voices, which is deeply unsettling because children rarely acknowledge the concept of volume control unless bribed. Something here simmers beneath the surface, a tension so tangible it feels like walking through a pot about to boil over. At the market square, you overhear the first whispers. A farmer sells cabbages with the resigned expression of someone who knows half his earnings will vanish before sunset. He mutters about a noble who has instituted a temporary levy, which, judging by his tone, has lasted longer than some marriages. Another villager joins in, explaining in hushed tones that the noble's collectors visit every week, demanding coin, grain, or livestock, depending on what they think you can be guilted into surrendering. The collector's ledger, the farmer says, is thicker than the local prayer book. The taxes, however, are never recorded on the official rolls. You walk deeper into the town and find clusters of people speaking quickly and glancing over their shoulders with the paranoia of individuals who know eavesdropping is a regular hobby among tax officials. They whisper that the noble claims the money is needed for road repairs, though the only changed road is the one leading directly to his estate, now so smooth you could roll a barrel down it without spilling a drop. Another villager insists that the noble adjusted the tax amounts recently, apparently based on his personal assessment of each household's attitude. Anyone who hesitated during last month's collection magically received a higher tax the following week. You approach the tavern for more information, because taverns are where truth leaks out when ale loosens tongues. Inside, the atmosphere simmers with frustration and the smell of roasted onions. A group of tradesmen occupies a corner table, arguing over how much coin they owe versus how much is actually written in the town's official accounts. One slams his mug down and swears the noble is running a private collection scheme, pocketing the difference and sending forged reports to the crown. Another insists he saw the noble's steward burning parchment late at night behind the manor, claiming it was a cold evening despite the fact that the air had been warm enough for mosquitoes to hold celebrations. As they talk, you piece together a pattern. The noble leverages disasters to justify taxes. but the disasters often appear suspiciously timed. A barn burns down right after a household disputes the levy. A suspicious illness spreads only in neighborhoods known for questioning authority. Each event fuels fear, and fear makes taxes easier to collect. It becomes clear that this is not governance. It is extortion written in cursive. You leave the tavern and walk the quiet streets. Noticing how many homes have scratched wood near the doorframes, as though collectors knock hard enough to bruise the entire building. A woman sweeping her doorstep tells you the noble began this scheme years ago, slowly enough that no one noticed its beginnings. But now the town chokes under the weight of it. And they whisper, not because secrecy adds drama, but because speaking too loudly might summon the noble's men. Centuries pass. The noble's estate crumbles. The town evolves. The scandal fades into a half-remembered tale told by elderly storytellers who shake their heads and claim the past was a messier place. But then historians researching regional finance stumble upon a collection of contracts and letters preserved in an archive that smells like old parchment and vindication. The documents include copies of the noble's forged reports, careful records of his private income, lists of inflated tax amounts, and correspondence between him and several corrupt officials who agreed to look the other way in exchange for a percentage. The proof is undeniable. Every whispered accusation was true. Every villager's suspicion was valid. The noble had exploited his authority to create a personal revenue stream disguised as civic duty. His scheme spanned decades, affecting thousands and shaping the town's economy long after his name was forgotten. You remember the dust-filled streets, the fearful glances, the tavern arguments, and the oddly smooth road leading to the noble's estate. The truth unravels the same way the townspeople once described it, piece by piece, whisper by whisper, until the full picture emerges in stark, irrefutable ink. The noble's scheme had been hidden behind titles and seals, but the people had seen it clearly all along. You meet the chroniclers in a dim chamber tucked behind the royal archives, a room that smells of ink, vellum, and the quiet despair of people who know too much but cannot say it out loud. They sit hunched over writing desks, quills scratching with the urgency of men racing against time and politics. At first they greet you with polite caution, the kind nobles use before they decide whether you are friend, foe, or someone who might ruin their afternoon. But when you mention the royal advisor, their eyes flicker in a way that tells you have stumbled onto the topic they discuss only. When doors are bolted and windows shuttered, one of them leans forward, lowering his voice to a whisper barely audible over the crackling of the hearth. He claims the advisor holds more power than any royal relative, more influence than the commanders who lead armies, and more access to secrets than the king himself. Another chronicler nods, adding that the advisor controls appointments, court decisions, and even the interpretation of omens. A third insists that every major policy in the last decade bears the advisor's invisible signature, even though the king announces them as his own. Their quills twitch with agitation as they trade examples, each more troubling than the last. You follow their words deeper into the castle, tracing the advisor's shadow without ever seeing the man himself. Servants speak of him with muted dread, claiming he always appears where he should not be, overhearing conversations meant for private ears. Courtiers stiffen when his name comes up, careful to praise him just enough to avoid suspicion. A steward confides that the advisor knows the contents of sealed letters before the wax cools. Even the guards, usually proud of their stoicism, exchange uneasy glances when asked about him. You catch glimpses of the advisor from afar, a tall figure gliding through corridors with the self-possession of someone who never needs to raise his voice to be heard. He wears nothing extravagant, but his simplicity feels intentional, like a trap designed to make people underestimate him. His expression rarely changes, yet you see the way people stiffen when he passes, shrinking slightly as though their secrets cling to him like dust. When he enters the council chamber, discussions shift direction almost instantly, as if the king and nobles unconsciously orbit him. You begin noticing patterns. The nobles who challenge him lose favor mysteriously. Those who flatter him rise faster than merit should allow. Villages that petition directly to the crown without going through him inexplicably wait months for a reply. Minor changes to the law ripple outward in ways that benefit only a few, though the public face of these decisions always bears the king's seal. It becomes clear the advisor has woven himself into the machinery of governance so thoroughly that removing him would require dismantling the entire structure. Late one evening, you return to the chronicler's chamber. They have pulled out journals normally hidden beneath locked drawers, their faces lined with the exhaustion of men burdened by truth. They open the pages cautiously, showing you entries they never intended for anyone outside their circle. Notes on meetings the advisor attended long before the king requested them. Observations of decisions quietly altered after the advisor whispered something in the ruler's ear. Records of nobles pressured, ambassadors redirected, armies repositioned, without the king ever giving direct command. Some entries to grow darker. One chronicler describes how the advisor convinced the king to dismiss an entire council under the guise of efficiency. Another details the advisor's role in arranging a marriage alliance that benefited his personal network more than the kingdom. A third document reveals the advisor's habit of manipulating reports before they reach the king, ensuring his version of events became the only version available. The chroniclers write in veiled terms, disguising their fear behind careful phrasing. But the truth bleeds through every word. Years pass, and the advisor's influence becomes the stuff of rumor and academic speculation. Scholars debate whether he was a mastermind or merely lucky. The crown's official histories mention him only briefly, describing him as a loyal servant whose wisdom guided the realm. But the chronicler's private journals, discovered centuries later during a restoration of the archives, paint a far more complex portrait. Their ink, faded but legible, reveals how deeply he shaped policy, diplomacy, justice, and even the king's own worldview. They show the calculated manipulation of information, the cultivation of alliances, and the quiet removal of anyone who disrupted his plans. Historians realize that entire chapters of the kingdom's history were molded not by the monarch's hand, but by the advisor's subtle, persistent influence. You remember the chronicler's hunched forms, their trembling quills, their whispered warnings. You remember the advisor's silent steps echoing through the hallways, the way every courtier seemed to swivel toward him without meaning to. And you understand at last that power in a medieval court does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it carries a quill and speaks softly, enough to rewrite a kingdom. You hear the first whisper about forged seals from a pair of grooms arguing beside the palace stables, their voices low enough to suggest they are more afraid of eavesdroppers than of the horses currently trying to chew on their sleeves. They speak of royal decrees that appear overnight, stamped with the king's emblem, yet carrying orders no one remembers being discussed. One decree demands taxes from villages that already paid. Another grants land to a noble who somehow knew the decree existed before anyone else saw it. A third reverses a previous ruling with such dramatic confidence, you would think laws were meant to be swapped like spare tunics. The grooms catch you listening and fall silent with the synchronized panic of men who have absolutely said too much. You move on, pretending to admire the architecture while trying to ignore the growing suspicion gnawing at the edge of your mind. Inside the castle, the corridors hum with tension. Scribes rush past with armfuls of parchment, their expressions tight, their footsteps sharp. One mutters that he copied a decree twice because the first version vanished mysteriously from his desk. Another complains that the royal seal feels different each time he touches it, as if it has a secret life no one authorized. You slip into the archives with the casual confidence of someone who definitely does not belong there. Shelves tower overhead, stuffed with scrolls, records, and more dust than knowledge. You watch clerks examine documents by candlelight, holding each parchment to the flame as though checking for invisible ink or moral decay. Occasionally, one clerk frowns deeply at a decree, comparing the seal to another older document. They press fingertips to the wax, studying the edges of the imprint. Some seals are crisp, perfectly symmetrical. Others look slightly distorted, as if pressed with a shaky hand or a stamp carved by someone in a hurry. A clerk notices your interest and beckons you closer. He speaks in a whisper, thin enough to disappear if a candle flickers too strongly. He tells you there are too many decrees lately, too many unexpected orders, too many inconsistencies in wax that should never vary. He suspects forgery, though he dares not say it above a murmur. The seal is supposed to be sacred, inviolate, a physical extension of the king himself. To forge it is treason. To forge it successfully is something worse. It is power taken from the crown without drawing a sword. You ask who might be responsible, and the clerk only shakes his head. It could be an ambitious, noble, a corrupt official, a scribe with exceptional nerve, or someone positioned so high that everyone assumes innocence by default. The clerk confesses that the seals appear so genuine even he doubts his own instincts. Someone out there knows the weight of the royal signet, the exact pressure needed to create its impression, the composition of the wax used only for official decrees. Someone, in other words, has access they should not have. As days pass, rumors spread like embers catching dry straw. A decree appears that contradicts a recent alliance. Another arrives demanding payment from a monastery exempt from taxes for decades. Courtiers panic quietly, trying to determine which orders are real and which are traps. Even the king grows uneasy, inspecting documents with narrowed eyes as though searching for betrayal hidden inside the wax. You witness him confront his council, the room crackling with tension, but no one steps forward. Silence fills the chamber, heavy and guilty. When you leave the kingdom months later, the mystery remains unresolved, a cloud lingering over every document and every decision. The forged seals become legend, blamed for every political misstep and every sudden shift in fortune. Some say the culprit fled. Others say the culprit remained, perfectly protected by rank and influence. The truth stays buried, indistinguishable from rumor. Centuries roll forward, carrying the mystery with them, until modern historians begin testing royal documents with the precision of alchemists who grew tired of waiting for magic. Chemical analysis reveals differences in wax composition. Microscopic inspection shows tiny irregularities in the forged seals, inconsistent with the official signet. The forgeries cluster in specific years, pointing to a window of opportunity exploited by someone with access to the royal chambers. Further research uncovers correspondence hinting at political maneuvers benefiting only one faction, conveniently aligned with the time of the forged decrees. The evidence becomes irrefutable. Not every decree came from the king. Some came from a hidden hand bold enough to wield royal authority from the shadows. The deception was real, subtle, and devastatingly effective. You remember the uneven seals, the nervous clerks, the whispered suspicions. You remember the uneasy flicker of candlelight on wax that should have been flawless. And you understand that power in the medieval world did not always wear a crown. Sometimes it hid inside a drop of wax. You climb the winding road toward the fortress, a hulking silhouette of gray stone perched on a cliff that seems permanently irritated by the wind. From afar it looks ordinary in the medieval way, all jagged battlements and narrow windows designed for archers or for people who dislike sunlight. But the villagers below insist the place once held a prisoner, no chronicle ever mentioned, someone erased from official memory so thoroughly that only rumor kept him alive. They tell you this with the trembling excitement of people repeating a secret they barely understand. When you step through the fortress gate, the atmosphere shifts. The guards watch you with a suspicion so practiced it could be an inherited skill. Inside, corridors twist unexpectedly, as though the architects were either drunk or deeply committed to confusing intruders. You wander under low arches and past torch brackets that burn just bright enough to reveal dust and old scratches on the walls. Servants carrying buckets stop talking when you pass, but their eyes flick toward a particular stairwell with a nervousness they try and fail to hide. You follow their glances to a spiral staircase disappearing into the depths below. The air grows colder as you descend, the torches flickering as if reconsidering their commitment to lighting your path. At the bottom lies a narrow hall lined with rusted chains and iron rings hammered into the tane wall. You tell yourself these are relics of past sieges or storage for tools, but the way the floor dips from long wear suggests pacing, not storage. Footsteps repeated day after day until stone yielded. A guard appears at the end of the hall, startled to find you there. His hand hovers near his sword, not out of aggression, but from the reflex of someone trained to protect something he cannot name. He insists this part of the fortress is unused, though the freshly swept floor says otherwise. The torch near him burns longer than the others, trimmed recently. He offers to escort you. Elsewhere, his tone polite but tight, as though afraid you might ask a question he is forbidden to answer. Later, you explore the upper chambers, where tapestries hide drafts and tension equally well. A steward leads you through rooms filled with armor, dusty records, and furniture built to withstand both time and questionable taste. When you inquire again about the lower halls, he stiffens and offers a smile too stiff to trust. He says prisoners were never kept here. There were none, ever, not officially. His insistence is smooth, but his eyes flick toward the staircase with something between guilt and fear. You spend the night in a guest chamber where the wind moans through the narrow window, rattling shutters that have probably seen worse. Sometime after midnight, while you lie awake listening to the fortress breathe, you hear footsteps, not above, not beside, below. Slow, measured, as though someone long used to walking in circles still follows the rhythm even in death or memory. The sound fades only when the wind grows louder, swallowing it whole. The next morning, you speak with the oldest soldier in the garrison, a man with a face like cracked leather and a voice that rumbles like distant thunder. He refuses to discuss prisoners, but he mentions, almost accidentally, that one chamber in the lower level is bricked over. When you ask why, he shakes his head and mutters that some names should never be spoken again. Then he limps away, leaving you with more questions than answers. Centuries pass, and the fortress becomes a heritage site for scholars with too much curiosity and too little sense. During a restoration, workers pry loose a stone in one of the unused chambers. Behind it they find a narrow cavity, dusty but intact. Inside lies a small wooden box sealed with twine. The scholars open it carefully, expecting mundane relics, perhaps old coins or rotted paperwork. Instead, they find diaries, pages filled with cramped handwriting, descriptions of a man imprisoned without trial, notes about his meals, his illnesses, his attempts to plead his innocence. The writer describes him as educated, polite, and terrified. The entries grow darker each year, shifting from hope to despair until the last lines trail into smudges where ink and tears mix. The diarist never names the prisoner, only calls him the one we cannot record. Historians confirm the handwriting belongs to a past warden, a man known for loyalty and discretion. Additional diaries reveal the prisoner came from influential circles, someone whose existence embarrassed or threatened the crown. Orders were given verbally. Records were destroyed. Only these, Hidden diaries survived to expose the truth the fortress had smothered. You remember the cold hall, the pacing marks in the stone, the guards' fearful glances, the footsteps that woke you in the night, and you realize the unrecorded prisoner was never a legend. The fortress had held its secret. The walls had told the story long before the ink did. You first hear it in a cloister walkway, the kind where cold stone presses against your boots and every footstep echoes like a confession you did not mean to make. Two clergy shuffle past you, whispering in low voices meant for no one but the new, drafts, and the virgin. You do not catch every word, but the tone carries enough weight to make the candles tremble. Something about a relic that is not the relic, a replacement cloaked in ceremony and panic. You slow your pace, pretending to study a carved pillar while the whispers linger like smoke. Inside the chapel, everything looks exactly as it should. Gold gleams. Incense curls lazily from a burner that has seen more ceremonies than truth. And there, beneath a canopy of embroidered silk, rests the prized relic, a bone fragment said to belong to a saint who spent his life chasing demons and lecturing sinners. The faithful kneel with reverence, oblivious to the tension coiling in the air. You watch as a monk adjusts the reliquary ever so carefully, his hands steady but his eyes darting around to see who might be watching. Later, you approach him in the cloister garden where herbs grow beside wild gossip. He claims nothing is amiss, offers a practiced smile, then immediately changes the topic to weather. Monks love weather. It is the safest subject in Europe. But his fingers keep tugging at his sleeves, betraying a restlessness that does not match the peaceful setting of parsley and thyme. Before you can press further, the bell rings for prayer, and he scurries away with a speed that raises more suspicion than clarity. As evening settles, the abbey grows quieter but never silent. Stone buildings retain whispers like secrets trapped in mortar. You overhear another pair of clergy debating the risk of the discovery. They speak as men haunted by responsibility, the kind who would rather face the last judgment than be caught mishandling a sacred object. One insists the swap was necessary. The other mutters, that deception is still deception, no matter how holy the intent. Their silhouettes fade into the shadows, leaving you with the uncomfortable realization that even holy men panic when relics go missing. You linger in the scriptorium, where the flickering lamps cast long shadows across manuscripts and inkpots. A scribe, with ink stained fingers, tells you stories about pilgrims who traveled for weeks to see the relic, believing it could heal, bless, or at the very least justify the terrible stew they had eaten along the way. He avoids your questions about authenticity, instead launching into a ramble about illumination techniques. But as he turns to fetch a parchment, something falls from his sleeve, a small scrap of vellum. You glimpse a sketch of the reliquary, annotated with measurements that do not match what you saw earlier. In the middle of the night, when the abbey falls into its uneasy slumber, you wander the hallways with only moonlight and curiosity for company. Near the storeroom, you hear movement. Someone opens a chest, metal hinges creaking in protest. You peek through the doorway and catch the faint outline of a monk lifting a wrapped object, his breath quick and unsteady. Before you can determine what he is carrying, he snuffs the lantern and disappears into the darkness as if absorbed by the very stone. Centuries sweep past. The relic becomes part of museum tours and holiday fundraising brochures. Scholars argue about its provenance with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for tournaments or wine. Then one day, a laboratory analysis finally breaks the debate wide open. Radiocarbon dates contradict the relic's alleged age. Microscopic studies reveal tool marks modern to its era, not ancient. Another fragment discovered in a sealed abbey chest matches the age and condition expected of the true relic. It had been hidden away all along, wrapped in cloth and tucked behind old ledgers that smelled faintly of beeswax and fear. Historians reconstruct the likely events. A crisis of preservation, perhaps, a fear that the original relic was decaying, or maybe it was, taken to protect it from thieves. replaced in haste to maintain the abbey's prestige. Whatever the motive, the clergy had performed their swap in silence, trusting the stone walls to guard their secret. You remember the whispers, the restless eyes, the hurried footsteps in the night. And now, with science peeling back the last veil, you realize the conspiracy was not born of greed or malice, but of panic disguised as piety. The relic you had once stood before, glowing under stained glass light, had never been what it claimed. Yet the devotion, the prayers, the pilgrim tears, all of that had been real. The object had changed, the faith had not. You hear the rumor first beside a campfire that burns low and smoky, the kind of fire that makes everything taste faintly of charcoal and poor decisions. The soldiers surrounding it speak with the tense energy of men who have seen too much and trust too little. Their armor is dented, their boots muddy, and their expressions hollow. When one of them mentions the general, the conversation tightens like a bowstring. They glance around, making sure no officer lurks in the shadows, then begin whispering in the tone of people, discussing a ghost they half believe in. They say the general sends allies into battles they cannot win, then arrives just late enough to feign sorrow. They claim supply wagons meant for friendly forces mysteriously vanish under his command, only to reappear stocked and shining beside his favored to units. A younger soldier swears he saw the general hand a sealed letter to a messenger who never returned, a detail he admits while staring directly into the fire as though hoping the flames might erase the memory. Each man adds a new scrap of suspicion until the tale becomes a tapestry woven from fear, bitterness, and the uncomfortable possibility that loyalty itself has been weaponized. The next morning, you march alongside them through a landscape scarred by war. Charred fields stretch into the distance, dotted with broken siege engines and abandoned helmets half swallowed by mud. The soldiers move with grim determination, but you notice how they tense whenever a courier rides past, as if expecting news designed to wound rather than aid. You watch their eyes shift not toward the enemy's territory, but toward their own command tent, the place where orders are born and trust goes, to die. You glimpse the general later that day, seated atop a chestnut horse with the posture of a man carved from cold confidence. His armor gleams unnaturally compared to his troops, polished so brightly it could blind an optimist. He surveys the battlefield with a faint smile, not joyous, not cruel, just calculating. His officers hover beside him, too eager to please, too careful with their words. When he finally speaks, his tone is smooth, every syllable designed to sound reasonable. Yet something in the soldier's posture collapses, shoulders sinking as if they already know the orders will cost far more than they should. That night, when you ask around, the soldiers offer examples that make your skin crawl. A hill meant to be reinforced was deliberately left undefended. A signal meant to warn Allied units was delayed until the enemy had already charged. A bridge, essential to retreat, collapsed shortly after his engineers inspected it. Each incident could be explained away as misfortune, coincidence, or the chaos of war. But together, they form a pattern too deliberate to ignore. You witness another suspicious moment when a courier gallops into camp, covered in dust and urgency. The general meets him in the command tent, dismisses his officers, and speaks with the messenger privately. Minutes later, the courier rides off in the opposite direction the reinforcements expected him to go. The general emerges looking satisfied, and the entire command tent feels as though it exhaled something foul. The next day, the Allies positioned along the ridge receive no support. Their signal fires burn until they sputter out, unanswered. By evening, the survivors stumble into camp bruised, bloodied, and furious, cursing the general's name with a conviction no punishment could deter. The general greets them with a sympathetic nod and a speech polished enough to sound sincere. But the soldiers around you exchange looks that say they finally understand why victory always feels like loss. Years roll forward, and the war ends, taking with it countless tales, swallowed by time. The general is praised in official records, decorated for bravery, remembered as a strategic genius. The soldiers who whispered by the campfire scatter across the continent, their fragments of truth dismissed as bitterness or trauma. Then a set of war archives is uncovered in a forgotten armory during a restoration. Inside lie coded messages exchanged between the general and an opposing noble. The letters detail plans to prolong the conflict, weaken allied factions, and secure the general's future position regardless of the war's outcome. Supply manifests confirm he diverted resources away from his own side. Battlefield reports reveal discrepancies between his commands and what the king believed he had ordered. Scholars pore over the documents with dread, realizing each suspicious incident the soldiers described fits precisely into a larger scheme orchestrated by a man who valued power over victory. You think back to the campfire, the nervous glances, the stories told by exhausted men who trusted their instincts more than their commanders. You remember the general on his gleaming horse, the delayed signals, the bridge that collapsed after the engineer's visit. And you understand now that the betrayal had never been loud or dramatic. It had been quiet, strategic, and devastatingly intentional. You hear the first whisper of the guild in a cramped tavern lit by a single lantern that flickers as if reconsidering its purpose. 2. Travelers sit beside you, their hoods low, their voices lower, speaking about deaths that look like accidents but feel a little too convenient. They mention a guild, though the word catches in their throats like a bone. One claims the guild's members move through cities unseen. The other insists they can slip poison into a feast without disturbing a single goose feather. Their stories sound exaggerated, the kind born from ale and imagination, yet something in their tone carries a quiet certainty that sobers the room. Curiosity leads you into the city streets where shadows cling to the 20 presented. Stone walls in ways that feel intentional. At the marketplace, merchants gossip about nobles who die suddenly after political disputes. A butcher mentions a rival who vanished overnight. A washerwoman claims she found strange markings carved beneath the bridge, symbols she refuses to describe. Every tale shares the same uncomfortable thread. The deaths come without warning, without explanation, and without justice. You begin to notice how people glance behind them when speaking about certain topics, as if expecting an unseen listener trained to silence loose tongues. You follow these rumors to a district older than the rest of the city, a maze of narrow alleys where light struggles to reach the ground. The buildings lean inward, forming a canopy of crumbling timber and oppressive caution. Here you find a stone arch etched with faint lines resembling claw marks, though no animal you know would make them. Beneath it sits a small shrine dedicated to a forgotten guardian spirit. Offerings lie scattered at its feet, coins and candles placed with trembling fingers. Locals claim the shrine marks the boundary of the guild's territory. They warn you not to linger after dusk, unless you want to be mistaken for a client or a target. Inside a nearby tavern, the atmosphere thickens with secrecy. The barkeep sets down your drink with practiced neutrality when you ask about the guild. He says nothing, but the tightening of his jaw speaks louder than words. A cloaked stranger, seated alone in the corner, gestures for you to approach. He smells of old parchment and travel, the scent of someone who collects dangerous knowledge. He tells you stories of assassins who trained in rituals older than the city itself. They communicated through coded symbols carved into stones. They tested poison on rats in underground tunnels. They accepted payment in coin, favors, or secrets. Every time you begin doubting him, he adds a detail too precise to be invented. As night falls, you walk through the alleys again. A gust of wind pushes loose parchment across the ground. You pick one up, noticing a strange symbol pressed into the corner, a mark resembling an eye within a dagger. A chill snakes through you as you realize this is more than rumor. Someone left this deliberately, either as a warning or as proof of your curiosity being noticed. You fold the parchment and walk away quickly, reminding yourself that some truths do not appreciate being chased. Centuries unravel. The guild fades from spoken memory, becoming a footnote in stories told by candlelight. Historians label it folklore, an imaginative explanation for medieval political chaos. But during a distri, construction project in the city's oldest quarter, workers uncover something beneath the cobblestones. A chamber carved into the bedrock, hidden by meticulous stonework. Inside lie remnants of weapons shaped for discreet efficiency, vials sealed with ancient wax, and thin sheets of metal, inscribed with encoded instructions. The chamber walls bear the very symbols described in the rumors, etched in deliberate lines meant to guide those who lived in darkness. Archaeologists examine the tools and vials, performing tests that confirm the residues of historical poisons. They find tiny, bone fragments belonging to animals, likely used for experimentation. They discover narrow tunnels connecting to other chambers, creating a network that mirrors stories of assassins moving unseen through the city. Every artifact reinforces the tales once dismissed as drunken exaggeration. You remember the hushed conversations, the clawed archway, the parchment marked with a symbol you now know was real. You recall how the city seemed to hold its breath in certain alleys, how the locals avoided specific corners with the caution of people raised on inherited fear. And you understand now that the guild had never been myth. It had simply been very, very good at hiding. You arrive at the trial in a crowded courtyard where the air feels too still for a place filled with so many bodies. People cluster under the wooden awning, murmuring with the excitement of onlookers hoping to witness something scandalous enough to repeat for years. The accused stands in chains near a raised platform, a thin figure wrapped in travel-worn robes, looking more confused than condemned. You study his face. There is fear in it, yes, but also a bewilderment so raw it almost seems impolite to stare. He does not look like someone tangled in grand heresy. He looks like someone who has misplaced a turnip and cannot understand why everyone is yelling. The Inquisitor steps forward, robes flowing with theatrical gravity, carrying a ledger so large you suspect it contains not just accusations, but perhaps the weather forecast and lunch menu as well. He reads the charges in a booming voice designed to impress anyone who enjoys echoing acoustics. The list is long, bizarre, and stitched together with all the coherence of a drunken tapestry. The accused supposedly plotted with foreign cults, summoned spirits in the forest, spread forbidden texts, and according to one enthusiastic witness, caused milk to curdle simply by passing a barn. None of it fits. You watch the crowd's shifting expressions, and you can tell many of them sense the same thing. Even the chickens tied near the market stalls look skeptical. When the accused tries to speak, guards hush him with rough hands. He manages only a few words before being cut off. He says he never left the kingdom, knows no cults, owns no books except a psalter missing half its pages, and once fainted at the sight of a dead rat. He certainly does not sound like an architect of spiritual revolt, but the Inquisitor nods solemnly, as though he expected such denials. Dramatic denial is practically a requirement at these events. Witness after witness steps forward. Their statements unravel, like twine chewed by barn cats. One claims the accused lit candles in a suspicious pattern. Another swears she saw him reading a strange parchment, though she cannot describe it beyond parchment-shaped. A farmer insists the accused once asked directions to a hermitage, which apparently is damning enough to raise eyebrows. Each testimony contradicts the last, yet the Inquisitor writes diligently, quill scratching, as though everything makes sense. You stand under the heat of the midday sun, watching a performance that pretends to be justice. The crowd grows restless. Some people shift uncomfortably, others whisper, doubts, but no one speaks loudly enough to matter. Doubt is safer when it stays small. The trial ends abruptly, without clarity, without resolution, without anything resembling truth. The accused is dragged away to a cell. The crowd disperses, muttering a mixture of curiosity and relief that the spectacle has ended. You remain still, unsettled by the hollow ring of the proceedings. Nothing matched, nothing aligned, and yet the finality of the verdict felt predetermined, as though the trial existed only to decorate a decision already made. Years pass, the kingdom changes, the trial slips into memory, becoming one of many strange stories buried beneath more urgent matters. But centuries later, in a quiet archive filled with brittle parchment and drifting dust, scholars uncover a stack of transcripts. They are incomplete, water-stained, and written by multiple hands, but the truth shines through the smudges like a lantern through fog. The inquisitor had fabricated evidence. Testimonies were coerced. Witnesses were bribed, threatened, or simply told what to say. The accused was targeted because he angered a noble by refusing to surrender land. The trial was never about to heresy. It was a weapon disguised as righteousness. Letters reveal private conversations between officials planning the ordeal. They discuss how to frame the charges convincingly, how to silence dissent, how to ensure the accused never leaves the trial alive. The conspiracy is laid bare in ink now, faded but damning. You recall the bewildered man in chains, the contradictory testimonies, the inquisitor's theatrical confidence. Every piece of doubt you felt now crystallizes into certainty. Nothing in that courtyard had been about faith or truth. It had been about power wearing a holy mask. You hear the whispers first in a perfumed corridor, where tapestries hang like silent witnesses. Ladies in fine gowns glide past you, their shoes clicking softly against polished stone, and every time the topic of the royal marriage arises, their voices dip to the level of conspirators, sharing a stolen secret. They speak of the union as though it were a beautifully wrapped package hiding something unpleasant underneath, like a gift box that jingles suspiciously. They mention timing that was too perfect, negotiations that were too fast, and celebrations that felt more like distraction than joy. As you move deeper into the palace, the scent of wax and roses trails behind servants carrying trays, their faces carefully blank. You stop one who recognizes opportunity and gossip the way bees recognize flowers. She leans closer, whispering that the royal bride arrived in the kingdom. Suddenly, without the usual parade of ambassadors or months of discussion, one day she was a foreign noble's daughter tending to her falcons, and the next she was gliding down the aisle beside a prince whose smile looked carved rather than felt. The servant insists the queen's dowry was oddly modest, her attendants fewer than expected, her past spoken of only in vague phrases like from a respected house or favored by fortune. Nobody seems able to explain what made the marriage necessary, only that it was. Rumors cling to the palace walls like ivy. Some say the prince had been caught in a scandal that would have cracked the kingdom's reputation like an egg against stone. Others suggest the bride had her own shadow trailing behind her. Some whispered indiscretion swept under the carpet before it could trip anyone. You hear about a noble's daughter dismissed from court around the time of the wedding, her lands confiscated under mysterious circumstances. A few claim the foreign princess brought with her a child disguised as a page. Others insist she carried letters sealed so firmly the wax nearly fused to the parchment. You begin noticing subtle exchanges. A courtier lowering his voice when discussing lineage, a steward flinching when you mention the timing of the wedding, a herald quickly shifting topics when genealogy arises. Even the king looks uncomfortable whenever the marriage is praised too earnestly, as though compliments prod at a bruise he hoped no one else would notice. The queen herself moves with calm grace, but her silences feel thick, carefully measured. Her smile is polite, her gestures elegant, yet there is a flicker in her eyes when she gazes at the prince. Not affection, not hostility, something more complicated, something that suggests agreement rather than choice. One afternoon, you wander into the palace gardens where sunlight glints off fountains and lazy bees drift from flower to flower with enviable indifference. You overhear two elderly courtiers arguing in sharp whispers. One says, "The royal marriage saved the dynasty." The other retorts, "It merely delayed the consequences of a mistake made in the wrong bedroom with the wrong person at the wrong time." Their words slice the air, but once they notice you, they separate as if stung, returning to idle talk about roses and rainfall. Years pass. The marriage solidifies into legend. Court poets praise it. Artists paint it. Scholars reference it as an example of diplomacy. The questions fade, replaced by stories, polished until they shine with manufactured harmony. Yet the itch of suspicion lingers, the feeling that something crucial had been carefully folded into the margins of history. Centuries later, genealogists poring over dusty records and brittle documents uncover inconsistencies. Birth dates that do not align. Titles granted without lineage to justify them. A sudden shift in a noble family's fortunes precisely when the royal marriage occurred. More startling still, the remains of a sealed chest found in a crumbling estate reveal letters between foreign nobility discussing a scandal too severe to allow their daughter to remain unmarried. The correspondence hints at rumors of impropriety, disputed paternity, political danger, and a desperate need to tether her future to a powerful crown. Another set of documents surfaces in the royal archives, describing the prince's own entanglement with a noblewoman whose disappearance from court had confounded historians. The letters, half burnt but legible enough, reveal negotiations to neutralize two scandals simultaneously through a single, hastily arranged marriage. The genealogical charts align the final pieces. Bloodlines reveal a child whose parentage was never publicly acknowledged, a line grafted quietly into the royal tree, smoothed over by time and secrecy. The marriage had not been a symbol of alliance, but of necessity, a patch stitched over a tear that history had not been meant to examine too closely. You remember the glances, the hurried whispers, the stiff smiles. You recall the queen's careful composure and the prince's carved expression. The palace had never celebrated a perfect union. It had celebrated a solution. You hear the first tale of the seer on a fog-soaked morning in a small village where even the chickens look suspicious of the weather. A group of travelers gather around a well, trading rumors with the eagerness of people who know gossip moves faster than any horse. They speak of a woman who drifts between towns like a leaf on the wind, her cloak tattered, her voice soft, her visions unsettlingly precise. She appears without warning, leaving predictions behind her like footprints that refuse to fade. Curiosity pushes you to follow the murmurs until they shape themselves into a path. In each village you pass through, the stories repeat with eerie consistency. She warned a reeve to delay a grain shipment, and the road flooded the next day. She urged a merchant to avoid a business deal, and the noble involved was disgraced by month's end. She told a shepherd to move his flock moments before a rock slide thundered down the hillside. Her visions are not grand prophecies of kingdoms rising or falling. They are practical, intimate warnings, wrapped in a simplicity that makes them impossible to ignore. When you finally see her, she sits on a crooked wooden stool beside a crossroads shrine, humming a tune that carries no melody yet sticks to your thoughts. People approach her reluctantly, as though afraid her gaze might reveal something personal they have spent years hiding. She greets each person with the same quiet warmth, offering predictions without theatrics. No smoke, no trances, no dramatics. Instead, she speaks as though simply reporting what she sees in the air around them. A young squire kneels before her, asking whether his commander will return from battle. The seer tilts her head, eyes distant yet focused, and answers with a gentle certainty. "Not soon," she says, "but safely." The squire exhales shakily, gratitude spilling from him like water breaking free from a dam. A merchant asks if he should accept a newly offered contract, and she advises caution, describing details she shouldn't possibly know. The merchant leaves pale-faced, muttering that he will renegotiate immediately. When it is your turn, she glances at you with eyes that seem to carry centuries, though her face remains unlined. Before you can ask a question, she tells you to avoid the next city until after the feast day. A roof tile will loosen in the wind, she says, and you do not want to be standing beneath it. Her voice is calm, almost amused, as if predicting falling masonry is just another daily task. You thank her awkwardly, uncertain whether to believe her. But as you travel onward, you hear more troubling stories. A noble received her counsel, then abruptly changed his vote in a council session. A military captain shifted his troops after she intercepted him in a village square, saving them from an ambush that had been planned with cruel precision. A diplomat turned his caravan around because she warned him that a dispute he hoped to settle would erupt before he arrived. People begin to wonder whether her visions influence politics more than any treaty, and for every grateful follower, there is a suspicious noble who mutters that no wanderer should wield this much invisible power. One evening, as rain drums against your cloak, you reach an inn where the atmosphere trembles with unease. Patrons huddle around a hearth, arguing whether the seer should be celebrated, feared, or quietly escorted far from courtly affairs. A scholar insists she threatens the natural order. A farmer swears she saved his family. A guard claims the crown has begun taking her warnings into account during strategic planning. The conversation spirals until someone notices you listening, and the room falls into that prickly silence that smells strongly of superstition and recently spilled ale. Years eventually wear down the legends. The seer vanishes from the roads one season, fading from sight as quietly as she arrived. Some say she retired to a monastery. Others believe she simply walked into the woods and never returned. Her name stops drifting through taverns. Her predictions dissolve into folklore, but centuries later, historians uncover correspondence written by nobles, generals, and diplomats who lived during her wanderings. Letters mention her by name. They record the decisions she altered, the disasters she prevented, the strategies reshaped because of her warnings. A military logbook confirms she saved an entire battalion. A council record shows her influence in redirecting trade routes. Even a royal diary entry acknowledges her accuracy with a mixture of awe and discomfort. More astonishing still, several artifacts found in remote villages match her descriptions of events that had not yet occurred. Patterns traced through the documents reveal her predictions were not lucky guesses. They were precise interventions that altered the direction of political and military affairs across a wide region. You remember her calm presence, the way she spoke without drama, the way her words settled into your thoughts like seeds waiting for the right season. You recall the crossroads shrine, the hesitant villagers, the shifting expressions of those who received her guidance, and you understand that her visions had never been mere rumor. She had quietly shaped history from the roadside, one warning at a time. You arrive at the estate long after the feud has already soaked into the soil, the kind of bitterness that clings to stone and ivy with equal determination. Villagers greet you with the wary enthusiasm of people, eager to share a legend but terrified of its consequences. They say the feud began generations ago, sparked by a curse slung during a drunken argument at a midsummer feast. Ever since, tragedy has supposedly followed both noble houses with the efficiency of a tax collector and the charm of a thunderstorm. Cattle die mysteriously, harvests rot, marriages crumble, servants vanish. Children are born under strange omens. The villagers list these misfortunes with the theatrical flair of storytellers who fully believe every word. When you reach the first manor, you feel the tension before you even cross the threshold. The front door creaks as if groaning under centuries of resentment. Inside, portraits glare down from the walls with expressions that suggest they would still be feuding even if they were allowed to retire. The current lord paces the hall with wild gestures, muttering, about hexes and ancient insults. He swears the rival family cursed his bloodline, then proceeds to describe a string of calamities that sound more like poor planning than supernatural torment. His wine stores mysteriously spoiled, his falcons refuse to fly, his son married someone he disapproves of but blames entirely on the curse, as though magic personally arranged the courtship. Across the valley, the rival manor stands tall and imposing, its stone facade cracked like old parchment. The lady of the house greets you stiffly, her eyes sharp enough to slice through rumors. She recounts her own litany of misfortune: a collapsed roof beam, a rogue boar destroying an herb garden, a series of letters lost on their way to her allies. She insists these setbacks cannot be coincidence. The curse, she says, is alive. It breathes, festers, and waits. As you walk between the two estates, you feel the weight of their feud settle on your shoulders like a badly placed cloak. Every villager you encounter repeats the same story with mild variations, convinced the nobles are trapped in an endless loop of supernatural vengeance. The air hangs thick with superstition, as though the land itself expects lightning to strike the moment you ask the wrong question. But then you notice the letters. You find the first in the library of the second manor, tucked between dusty ledgers and a volume of herbal remedies no one has touched since literacy was optional. The handwriting is elegant, but hurried, as though the writer feared being caught. The letter references agreements, threats, and land disputes rather than curses. You find another in the first manor, stuffed behind a loose stone in the wall. This one uses unusual phrasing, a mixture of poetic formality and strategically vague accusations. Both letters mention dates that do not align with the villagers' stories. Both contain symbols in the margins, small flourishes that appear decorative until you notice they match. You gather more letters, always hidden in places meant to be forgotten. Some are half burned, others torn, others sealed in wax so old it crumbles like brittle sugar. You spread them across a table in the sunlight, watching the ink gleam faintly. Patterns emerge. The same phrases repeat in both sets of correspondence, the same references to financial trouble, the same mentions of a disputed inheritance. The so-called curse begins to look suspiciously organized. As you read further, you realize the symbols are not decorations at all. They mark coded passages. When aligned correctly, parts of the letters reveal messages that contradict the feud entirely. The nobles were not victims of a curse. They were participants in a secret negotiation, using coded letters to communicate about debts, alliances, and political risks. The feud acted as camouflage, convincing everyone that hostility separated them while their true relationship was a fragile cooperation hidden beneath theatrics. Misfortunes attributed to a curse line up neatly with seasons of political tension. Spoiled wine coincides with a canceled treaty. A collapsed roof is mentioned alongside a note about funds diverted to bribe an official. Lost letters appear during a land reassignment that neither family wanted. Recorded. The supposed curse was nothing more than strategic misfortune, orchestrated and exaggerated to mislead outsiders and protect both families' interests. Centuries pass, and historians uncover the same coded letters sealed in archival boxes. They decipher them with the excitement of archaeologists finding treasure. The scholars confirm the feud had never been supernatural at all. It had been a smokescreen, a stage play put on for generations, with entire villages unwittingly cast in supporting roles. You remember the haunted stories, the suspicious glances, the dramatic retellings of plagues and curses. You recall the portraits glaring from the walls, the nobles swearing they were victims of fate, and you realize the truth was never in the legends. It was hiding in the ink. You reach the village at dusk, when the sky hangs purple and heavy, and the houses crouch, together as if trying to avoid being noticed by the night. The place has the strained quiet of a community holding its breath. No laughter, no chatter. Even the animals seem to have taken a vow of silence, A group of locals stand near the well, whispering urgently, their faces tightening the moment they spot you. They greet you with the stiff politeness of people who desperately want you to leave before you start asking questions. You soon learn the village carries a reputation as dark as the smoke stains on the smithy chimney. Nearby towns call it cursed, haunted, tainted by rites best left unspoken. Travelers avoid it. Peddlers rush through without stopping. Rumors paint it as a place where villagers gather in secret circles under the moon, chanting forbidden words and calling upon forces polite society prefers not to name. These stories spread with the enthusiasm of gossip, collectors who never bother to check their sources. At the tavern, you sit among a few villagers, nursing drinks they clearly wish were stronger. A man with a scar across his cheek tells you there have been strange lights in the forest. A woman with trembling hands insists she heard distant chanting last week, echoing through the trees. Another claims animals have vanished mysteriously. None of them speak above a mutter, and none meet your eyes for long. The tavern keeper, who looks like he has seen more secrets than he has served ales, interrupts whenever a story becomes too specific. He smiles tightly, refills mugs, and changes the topic with a practiced ease that feels deeply unnatural. You step outside for air, only to find the town square emptier than before. Doors shut quietly as you pass. Curtains shift. A dog growls from behind a fence. The villagers fear something, but the village, fear does not feel supernatural. It carries the sharp edge of guilt, not reverence. And when you walk along the forest's edge, expecting eerie symbols or ritual pits, you find only broken branches and footprints leading back toward the village. If dark rites are occurring, they have an oddly mundane sense of direction. The next morning you speak with the elder, a stern woman with a gaze like sharpened flint. She denies everything with unwavering intensity. No strange rites, no rituals, no gatherings under the moon. When you ask about the forest lights, she blames hunters. When you mention the chanting, she suggests wind. When you ask why the village is so tense, she claims harvest worries. Her answers roll out too smoothly, like memorized lines rehearsed in front of a mirror. Suspicion pushes you to linger. You wander past a barn where two villagers argue in hoarse whispers. One insists they must tell someone before things get worse. The other hisses that speaking out will doom them all. You lean closer, but the moment they notice your shadow, they scatter like startled birds. You notice fresh wagon ruts leading toward an abandoned shed and follow them to a broken lock that hangs uselessly from the door. Inside, the air smells of earth and something metallic. You find disturbed soil, rough wooden planks, and the faint outline of where something heavy once lay before being dragged away. The pieces begin to shift in your mind. The villagers have not been performing dark rites. They have been hiding something. Centuries later, during an excavation near the same village, archaeologists uncover a shallow grave just beneath the abandoned shed's foundations. The remains belong to a traveling merchant known to have passed through the region at the time of the Twend. Rumors. His skull bears marks of blunt force. His coin pouch lies empty. Alongside the body are scraps of cloth matching the colors worn by villagers in that era. Historians cross-reference court records and uncover documents from distant officials who suspected foul play when the merchant disappeared but dismissed the rumors, believing the area too cursed to risk investigating. The village's reputation for dark rites had been a convenient shield. The villagers allowed it to grow, even fed into it, because superstition made outsiders keep their distance. The rituals had been nothing more than distractions, lies crafted to hide a very human crime. When you look back on your visit, everything sharpens. The fearful glances, the nervous tavern talk, the elders' quick denials, the chanting that was likely argument, the lights probably lanterns, the rituals merely a story, to cloak something far less mystical and far more damning. The village had never been a place of dark magic. It had been a place of fear, trying desperately to bury the truth. You first hear the rumor in a bustling market where the smell of spices, livestock, and questionable stew competes for dominance. Merchants shout prices with the confidence of men who believe volume is a business strategy. But beneath the noise, you catch snatches of a quieter conversation. Two traders lean over a crate of apples, discussing a decree that arrived last week, reshaping tariffs in a way that just so happens to benefit their guild. They speak with smug satisfaction, as though they have already calculated their profits. One even laughs a little too loudly before glancing around to make sure no official overheard him celebrating royal policy as though it were his personal accomplishment. The idea gnaws at you as you walk deeper into the market. Everywhere you turn, merchants seem oddly calm about changes most townsfolk groan over. A blacksmith mentions the new iron regulation with a shrug that does not match the expected frustration. A cloth seller smirks when discussing textile taxes. Even a fishmonger, who should by all rights be miserable at all times, looks almost cheerful about a decree that worsens his usual headaches. It is unsettling, suspicious, and it feels very much like a secret shared among people who assume you will not notice. When you question them directly, their expressions shift. Not guilt exactly, but the sudden stiffness of people orchestrating something they are convinced is clever. They claim the decrees simply favor hard-working folk. They insist the king has finally recognized the importance of trade. They speak as though the crown woke up one morning, stared into the distance, and declared, "Merchants are heroic now," but their eyes betray quiet triumph, the kind that flickers only when plans unfold exactly as designed. You begin spending time near the guild halls, sturdy buildings decorated with symbols announcing authority no merchant should legally possess. You notice heavy doors opened only after coded knocks, sealed letters exchanged beneath tables at alahouses, and late-night meetings where lantern light leaks through shutters with the urgency of conspirators running out of time. More than once, you spot messengers carrying satchels marked with the same crest. These messengers hurry toward the palace gates, where guards wave them inside with a familiarity that should not exist. Eventually, you slip inside the guild hall on a busy afternoon, blending with a crowd of apprentices delivering crates. The interior smells of wax and wool, with tables stacked high with parchment. You overhear a heated discussion about which decree to push next, as if royal authority were a menu they could rearrange. A senior merchant, plump and powdered, waves a wax seal in the air like a trophy. He claims it came directly from the king's secretary, though the secretary apparently requires reminders on what he agreed to. The room erupts in laughter, the smug kind that makes you want to wash your hands afterward. Late that night, you witness something stranger still. A small group of merchants gathers in a cellar lit by two lonely candles. They pull out several seals, each bearing the emblem of a different royal office. They use them to press mock decrees, testing phrasing, adjusting signatures, planning what they will request and how to disguise that their requests began in this very cellar. They speak with confidence born not of rebellion, but of routine. They know exactly how much influence they exert. They know exactly where the weaknesses lie, and they know exactly who in the palace responds favorably to coin delivered discreetly. The conspiracy becomes clearer with every passing moment. They are not forging decrees. They are guiding them, pressuring the right officials, buying the right favors, influencing laws before they even exist. Centuries blur forward. The guild halls collapse, rebuilt into city shops. The cellar becomes a wine storage room for an inn whose owner has no idea what once happened beneath his floor. But then archivists conducting a restoration of the palace discover a bundle of sealed letters wedged behind a panel. They bear the marks of merchant guilds, not royal offices. Further analysis reveals wax from those seals on decrees issued during the same period. The shapes match perfectly. Impressions left not by accident, but by design. Historians examine the correspondence and track the subtle shifts in economic policy that align too neatly with guild interests. They find notes from officials negotiating payments, lists of favors exchanged, instructions on how to disguise merchant-authored proposals as royal initiatives. The conspiracy had been real, running deep enough that the crown unknowingly handed power to the very people meant to answer to it. You remember the merchants' smirks, the coded knocks, the satchels carried confidently through palace gates. You recall the cellar lit by candlelight, seals pressed into wax with practiced precision, and you understand now that the crown had never acted alone. It had been nudged, guided, and molded by hands far less royal. You find the first clue in a monastery that looks as though it was carved from the mountain purely to keep secrets from escaping. The monks greet you with serene smiles, but the quiet around them feels manufactured, as if something vital has been swallowed whole by the stone. You wander through cloisters where carved saints stare down with the solemn judgment of people who absolutely know more than they are allowed to say. When you ask about the old treasury, the monks exchange looks that could charitably be called nervous and less charitably called incriminating. They claim the treasury vanished during a raid decades ago. They tell the story with the mechanical rhythm of men repeating a version polished, smooth by time. Raiders arrived, chaos erupted, and by sunrise, the chest of gold and relics had disappeared. According to them, the thieves fled into the mountains, never to be seen again. But the way they clasp their hands, too tightly, the way they glance at each other as if checking their lines, makes the tale wobble like a stool missing a leg. As you explore the monastery, you notice peculiar details. A fresco, poorly restored, with the section depicting the treasury noticeably brighter than the scenes around it. A room once used for accounts now locked, the key supposedly lost. Hallways where torch brackets appear newer than the stone they cling to. It feels like walking through a puzzle assembled by someone who forgot which pieces were supposed to stay hidden. Then you overhear two novices arguing behind the chapter house. Their whispers are sharp, frantic. One insists the truth will eventually surface. The other hisses that silence protects them all. You step closer, but by the time you reach the corner, both have vanished like startled birds. The courtyard is empty except for a rake abandoned on a patch of gravel. Silence settles thick and warm, as though it's trying to smother whatever fragments of conversation still linger in the air. You wander into the library, where dust motes drift lazily through weak sunlight. Shelves sag beneath the weight of parchment that smells faintly of beeswax and anxiety. You scan the catalogs and notice missing entries. Not erased, but carefully omitted. A gap between two dates where financial records should exist. Another where correspondence ceases abruptly. A monk passes behind you and stiffens when he sees the open catalog, gently, suggesting you might be more interested in hymnals. His smile aims for calm but lands somewhere closer to alarm. Days pass, and you follow rumors from nearby villages. Farmers claim they heard monks digging late at night, long after the raids ended. A shepherd swears he saw torchlight near a ravine where no path exists. Even a traveling peddler who delights in exaggeration admits that the monastery purchased far more lumber that year than makes sense for maintenance. Every story nudges your suspicion in the same direction. One evening, as mist pools in the valley, you walk the monastery, grounds alone. Near the old granary, your foot catches on a loose stone. When you kneel to examine it, you notice something odd. The ground is packed differently, the soil disturbed at a depth that suggests recent movement rather than the memory of an ancient theft. Beneath the stone, you find a small fragment of wood, carved faintly with the same pattern used on the monastery's old chests. You pocket the piece, unsure whether it is a clue or simply confirmation that you are now in deeper than any visitor should be. Centuries unwind. The monastery endures fires, renovations, and the slow, creep of time. The missing treasury becomes a legend told to entertain tourists and novices who do not yet understand which legends are allowed and which are not. Eventually, preservationists arrive to stabilize the crumbling structure. They remove old flooring, repair walls, and dig exploratory trenches around the perimeter. What they uncover begins as an accident. A shovel strikes something hollow. Beneath the granary lies a buried chamber sealed so thoroughly it feels like a womb of stone, untouched by light. Inside, workers find remnants of broken chests, scattered coins, iron clasps, and ledger fragments. The symbols match those used by the monastery centuries earlier. More astonishing still, they find tunnels leading away from the chamber, narrow passages carved with urgency, not craftsmanship. The vault had not been stolen during a raid. It had been hidden. The monks of the past had feared the raiders, feared their war-torn world collapsing around them, and instead of trusting chance, they buried their fortune beneath their own feet. They hid it so completely that even their descendants lost the truth, leaving only half-remembered warnings and carefully curated silences. You look back on the frescoes, the sealed room, the missing entries, the novice's argument, the disturbed soil. Every piece of the puzzle falls into place with a quiet inevitability. The treasury had not vanished. It had simply been swallowed by the monastery's need to survive. You stand on a hill overlooking the landscape you have wandered through for what feels like a lifetime, and the wind that brushes past your face smells of earth, smoke, and the ghosts of too many whispered truths. Below you lies the patchwork of villages, fortresses, monasteries, courts, markets, and forests that taught you more about the medieval world than any chronicler ever intended. You expected dusty legends, embellished stories, rumors bloated by generations of retelling. Instead, you found something far stranger. Every outlandish tale, every impossible rumor, every whispered accusation you once dismissed as medieval exaggeration revealed itself to be anchored in something solid, something real. As you stand there, memories crowd around you, like figures stepping out from the fog. You remember the monastery scribes hiding messages in their illuminated prayers. You remember the terrified villagers who swore strangers stalked the night, and the digs that later found proof buried inches beneath their feet. You remember the queen surrounded by slander that was not slander at all, but coordinated sabotage disguised as gossip. You remember the forged seals, the missing treasuries, the coded letters, and the secret tunnels carved into the bedrock of kingdoms. You had thought these tales dramatic flourishes added by history's storytellers. Now you know they were not flamboyant inventions. They were survival strategies. You think back to the merchants who shaped royal policy from shadowed cellars, the assassins who slipped through unseen corridors, the generals who turned betrayal into routine, and the villagers who cloaked a murder beneath superstition, because fear is sometimes easier to sell than truth. Each time you thought you had reached the edge of plausibility, the world leaned closer and whispered that you had underestimated it. Medieval people lived in a reality where information traveled slowly, danger traveled quickly, and power traveled silently. Nothing was too strange to be possible when survival demanded creativity that bordered on the absurd. You walk down from the hill, and the world seems to blur between centuries. The forest feels both ancient and alive, as if the trees themselves remember every secret whispered beneath their branches. The cobbled roads carry faint echoes of footsteps from those who moved unseen. The stones of abandoned keeps stand crooked yet stubborn, their walls humming with the weight of hidden rooms and buried scandals. Even the air feels different now, heavy with the understanding that the past was never as simple as you once believed. You wander toward a crossroads where a crumbling shrine leans sideways as though burdened by too many unspoken confessions. The wind shifts, carrying with it the faint scent of ink, fresh wax, iron, and rain-soaked parchment. You hear distant voices layered over each other, familiar yet fractured. Monks chanting coded prayers, minstrels singing half-truths, soldiers whispering about disappearing couriers, merchants plotting with a confidence they should not have possessed, villagers telling stories they were too frightened to explain. All those voices weave together into something vast. You stop walking because you realize you are standing not simply in a place, but at the intersection of everything you have uncovered. All the stories, all the conspiracies, all the hidden worlds overlap here, forming a web so intricate it makes your chest feel tight. You thought you were tracing isolated mysteries. You were tracing the shape of medieval reality itself. A world where paranoia was often wisdom, where secrets were currency, where legends sprouted from truth rather than embellishment. And now, standing in the middle of this crossroads, you see that the past was not a distant dream softened by time. It was a labyrinth of human motives, fears, ambitions, and decisions layered beneath centuries of retellings. You understand why people clung to conspiracies. They were not mad. They were simply paying attention. As the last light of day fades, you feel the presence of everything you have witnessed closing in around. Do you? Not threatening, simply existing with a clarity you had never sensed before. The medieval world was not a place of wild superstition, twisting harmless events into dramatic tales. It was a place where reality itself was dramatic enough. You breathe in the cool evening air and let the truth settle fully. You have not been wandering through legends. You have been walking through a reality stranger than the stories that survived it.